need to be working on that. It was certainly well received by the Superintendent Study Council in Johnson City. We were at ETSU, and they got a new dean there, and I think he had summoned his whole faculty to be there, or just about the whole faculty. There was about 20 out of the department, and they kind of got enthusiastic about going out and recruiting. So it seemed to be well received by that group, and I think is an extremely important subject. And certainly I think we've made some good progress on getting the report card out there. Also, I'm enthusiastic about the Ed TPA thing. I think that's one of the most important decisions we've made, but certainly still a lot of work to do. But it's an important subject, and Darrell, we appreciate you being here to join us. Okay, we've got an agenda that I think everybody has. We will plan to proceed with that agenda. And the first item, Candace, is update on the progress made in recent years regarding licensure and preparation.
Yes, well, thank you. And I do want to note, I'm going to be introducing this for Amy Wooten to take over and talk through some items with you this morning. But we thought it would be important to note some milestones that have taken place over the last 3 years that have brought us to this point. We have done that in K-12 because we've been through a very heavy transition period. The last almost 4 years have been transitional in many ways, and same for educator preparation and principal preparation, which we'll be talking more about at the April board meeting. So we're going to walk through some milestones in stakeholder engagement and networks, number one. Number two, some milestones in standards and assessment and some changes we've made in educator prep in those areas. Data and accountability, and I appreciate the chairman alluding to the strong work that's happened in that area. And then research and technology. So with that, Amy, I will turn it over to you to walk through some of those milestones and where we are today.
Great, thank you. Good morning. Oh, I was looking at my screen thinking it was going to move. I was actually really excited when the commissioner asked me to put together an overview of what we have accomplished in the last 3 years, because I think sometimes we forget to take a moment to reflect on what we have done, and I think that can really help us think deeply about what we need to do next. We do, as you said, have a lot of work yet to do. So I'll start by focusing a little bit on stakeholder engagement and networks. This has been one of the areas where I think we have made some of our most significant progress that doesn't necessarily relate to a policy, but is something that's really a critical component of our work. In 2015, we really had an inconsistent approach to direct stakeholder engagement regarding educator preparation. We didn't have a tool, in fact, to actually communicate with our ed prep faculty other than just trying to collect email addresses, and generally that was of deans, and sometimes those are the right folks for a topic and sometimes it's others. We also didn't have any strategy to convene with our educator preparation community outside of their year. They have meetings twice a year, their TAC team meetings that we would attend. So since then, we have produced a monthly newsletter, the EPP update, which we've been producing now for about 1.5 years. We send that out every month. It's been really well received, and we get some information from our internal team that tells us that we get a lot of, it gets opened a lot. So we know that people are actually reading it. And we've had a lot of positive feedback from our ed prep community about the newsletter and the fact that it helps them get direct information from the state much more quickly. So we're really proud of that. As you know, we also convene now quarterly an educator preparation working group. This group has been sort of in development since about 2015, right when we approved the new educator preparation policy. We started with an implementation working group. And I think that this engagement has really enabled us to have a lot of buy-in with our stakeholders because they are directly participating and advising related to this policy that directly affects them. We've been fortunate enough to be able to continue to convene that, and as a matter of fact, are selecting the members for the new Educator Preparation Working Group this afternoon. So we'll be able to announce the new working group very soon. And lastly, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later this afternoon, we've also engaged various EPP networks. As I mentioned, sometimes one of our challenges was if we wanted to do some work in a specific area like literacy, we didn't have a strong way to engage directly with those faculty. So we've done a lot of work to communicate and identify faculty in various areas, particularly related to partnerships and literacy, and we bring those folks together, and I'm going to talk about those in more detail later this afternoon, so I won't go into that anymore now. Standards and assessment, as you know, in 2014, we adopted a new policy that adopted the CAPE standards. I think this shift was a really important policy shift, but even more important was the implementation work that needed to be done following that shift. And we have worked, and again with the Educator Preparation Working Group, really did a lot of the work on this, clarified and standardized the comprehensive review process. And as a part of that, not only have we adopted new standards, but we have developed rubrics for those standards and identified very specific information and types of evidence that our educator preparation providers will be expected to present during that comprehensive review. In the past, that review had felt somewhat unwieldy, and just you would walk into rooms with boxes of paper and all kinds of evidence, and I can see folks smiling across the.
I lived that.
Yes, and there was no malintent there at all. It just was sort of a best guess effort a lot of times at what we needed to see and what reviewers were looking at. They were making their best decisions with what they had available to them. But I think we've made leaps and bounds related to that, and the way that we've standardized our expectations is going to really generate some better understanding for us of what are best practices in educator preparation. So we're really excited about
Amy,
that.
for Daryl's benefit particularly, can you just briefly explain CAPE standards and sort of how we're using those in Tennessee?
Sure. So
What they are.
CAPE is the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation. It's a national accrediting agency, and they worked with a large group to define the standards and expectations for educator preparation providers writ large. So there are 5 standards that relate to things like candidate quality, partnerships, outcomes that are produced explicitly related to things like completer effectiveness. They also ask providers to demonstrate how they are using data to improve their own procedures, and I feel like I've left out one key one that I can't remember off the top of my head. But partnerships, thinking deeply about those clinical experiences. So in Tennessee, and this was a long part of our discussion when we revised the policy, we offer 2 options for our providers. They can either engage in a state-managed review, and what that means is the department selects a set of reviewers who are primarily from Tennessee, both K-12 and other EPP faculty, to go and conduct the on-site visit. And the other option is for them to seek CAPE accreditation, which means that CAPE is the organization that leads the site visit, and so they select the team members. We do have some representation on that team from Tennessee, but the majority of the members are from outside of Tennessee.
What's the current mix between those that choose
It's
the state
about
and-
65% are CAPE accredited.
There's a cost, obviously, if you do the CAPE accreditation,
There
you get that
is.
accreditation, but there's a cost.
There is.
associated,
There's a
which
cost.
is-
Every EPP pays, and I believe they've changed the way that they their cost structure is structured, but I believe that it is directly related to the number of completers that you have. But it's quite expensive. And so
How
it is.
frequent is the review?
That review is every 7 years, and it tries to look at everything from the top to bottom of the provider. And in addition to those big standards, they do look at every individual program that's offered. But you'll see, and we'll talk about annual reports and some work we've done, and the board very much called for a way to review our providers more frequently than that 7 year comprehensive review.
Now, has Cape kind of gotten the new standards and so forth formalized? It seemed to me like the first couple years that they had that they were struggling to really get that under control and understand what they were doing. And I guess, how do we feel about Cape now?
Well, that's a great question. I will say we have had some fits and starts with them in terms of experiences that our universities have had during this transition phase they've been in. I am on the board rolling off of it actually this summer, and so I've served with them over the last year and a half and have honestly learned a lot about some of the challenges internally. They've had a great bit of staff turnover. Too much for an organization their size to maintain the continuity that we would all expect and the quality of training. So our universities have been critical of what they've experienced with CAPE. I think they're starting to get at a bit more of a transition point with them where they're comfortable with what they're providing going forward. But the quality of the training of the reviewers is mixed. You have off-site reviewers and on-site reviewers, and they're not necessarily hearing the same thing. And so the calibration has been off. And so we are hearing continued frustration with CAPE, even as of the TACTI meeting that we had about a month ago.
Yes. I would say that I think that the standards themselves are received fairly positively, and that CAPE has been somewhat responsive to the field in terms of some of the challenges with the standards early on. And so I think that makes me feel really good about where we are in this process, because I do think the standards are the right things for our providers to be, working toward meeting. And then in Tennessee, one of the challenges that CAPE has as a national organization is they have to work with providers all over the country who are all working under different policies. Well, we're fortunate, since our work is focused in Tennessee, we're able to set some standardized expectations for our providers here. So that's a benefit we have. Great question.
So, I think I'm gonna be the curmudgeon today. 65%, yeah, yeah. 65% of 44 schools leaves 16 colleges, not Cape.
No, but they go through our process, and maybe I'm biased, but
Process is as rigorous or more
Thank you.
rigorous.
Fair.
Yeah, and I was going to add in my earlier comments, and I apologize that I didn't, that the university programs that are CAPE accredited do like the CAPE standards, but they would say our process in terms of the program review is more rigorous, more understandable, and potentially more beneficial to them, which is why we have done these visits typically together, so they're getting both of those at the same time. But we do get very positive feedback about our review process.
There have been some conversations about the reasons that they maintain CAPE accreditation that are tied to, this is something that it's a seal that they want to be able to put on their website. And in fact, I believe that there is some financial reason for this that is tied up in funding streams for them as well.
Even though it costs money, they can make revenue.
Correct.
And just another side note too, to sort of exemplify what we're talking about. In the past, the board has been brought recommendations by the department and the state board that were more rigorous than what CAPE was recommending. Right. So that's where we've had some tension in terms of the review process with CAPE versus our state, is that we often came out with a heavier hand than what CAPE was assessing from their review.
So out of the 44 schools that we are measuring or evaluating, where are we in knocking them off? That's probably a bad sign. Checking them off.
Well, and I don't know if we want to go there yet, Amy, because I know you're going to share with us sort of based on the annual reports from this year, kind of which
Yes.
programs are not meeting the grade currently.
Yeah, but
In
if we're
terms
gonna
of the
do
content.
something every 7 years per
In terms of the
school,
review itself, how many have we touched with the
Yeah.
new review? Do you want to take?
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. This has been because you may remember this, that some providers were in sort of a legacy situation within Kate. And so this year has really been the first year that the providers that have gone through have been under CAPE. And I think we have had approximately 6 go through CAPE, either state managed or in the
The big
CAPE
difference
process.
now will
I
be
think we have
that
4 that we're bringing for
annual reports
recommendation.
happen, and so you can take action between that 7-year
Correct.
cycle for any school that's not meeting standard.
CAPE accredited or not.
Right, CAPE accredited or not, so you don't have to wait for those 7-year sort of reviews to take
because
action.
we're getting that detailed annual data.
Correct.
Yes, and we're going to have a significant presentation on that this afternoon, both to present our new platform.
No, later this morning.
Sorry, I'm thinking about pre-break
Prior
and
to noon.
post-break.
All right,
I'm sorry.
I'm
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But we're gonna share the reports and identify for you the 6 providers that are not meeting expectations.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Another significant change that we have made that I am just couldn't be more thrilled about how this is going has been the adoption of a new set of literacy standards. Of course, we have a major initiative in our state to increase our performance related to reading and very specific goals related to that. And we know that getting effective educators who know how to teach in literacy is a critical component of that. And we've done a lot of work with our teachers who are in the field to do that. But we knew that also that we needed to really revise and elevate our expectations for literacy instruction for educator preparation. And you're well versed in this, but we went through probably 12 months of revisions of our literacy standards with a lot of engagement of stakeholders in revising those and making sure that they are aligned to our expectations for Tennessee students. And so we have begun the process to have all of our providers implement those new literacy standards. We, in fact, hired a director of literacy for educator preparation who's been leading all of this work. And we held a series of convenings across the state with our ed prep providers just to get them oriented to the new standards. And then subsequently, we have been hosting literacy network meetings, and we have had representation from almost every single provider at all of those meetings. And I'll say that the conversations are shifting. We initially started with what are the new standards, and our providers are really understanding those new standards, talking about making changes to their programs. And one of the other really exciting things we're seeing happening is they're talking to each other. I saw our literacy faculty from across the state exchanging information, wanting to engage with each other about, how are you doing this and how are we doing this, and can we work on a project together that would be even better than our 2 individual projects. And I think that's just a really good sign for things to come in terms of how well our novice teachers are going to be prepared to provide literacy instruction.
Do we ever see schools hoarding skills and because of, I was in a meeting of teachers who were telling me that it's so competitive that principals do not want them to give up their secrets in order to give up their performance advantage. And I was given an example. I said, well, so if you were in Knoxville, let's say, a teacher wasn't in Knoxville, and you wanted to contact a teacher you knew of in Crossville, you're saying it's a good chance and this was about reading, you would be maybe rebuffed. You go, maybe not Crossville, but it's going on out there. And this doesn't have anything to do with you on what you're saying. It is interesting that they had, right or wrong, they had that view that this was proprietary information to that school district or that school.
I am not specifically hearing that. I thought you were going to say more, which we do hear about, is a teacher or a school choosing not to have a student teacher because of some of the pressure of making sure that the alignment that that teacher has all the way to the summative assessment is assured.
Yeah.
And bringing in a student teacher can be a challenge to that. So we hear that more often than what you're describing.
I heard that too. If it's a tested thing, they don't. Anyway,
We're going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. Not this afternoon. I'm going to keep y'all here all day.
After break.
After
After
break.
we're talking to an empty.
My dad would say I can do that. In addition, we're really excited about the new literacy expectations. The proposals are due on April 15th. We've also developed a really rigorous review process. So in the past, sometimes our review procedures have been sort of checklist type, are all the standards represented? And we're really taking a new approach to how we're reviewing these with rigorous expectations, with strong rubrics. We put out calls for reviewers. We got lots of applicants to be reviewers, so we feel like we have really high quality reviewers. We're conducting training with them to make sure that their reviews are rigorous and consistent, and so we're really excited about this process, and we'll be excited to report to you about that. I will say that I anticipate that not every proposal will be approved on the first round of this. This is a rigorous process, and it's intended to be that way. And we've talked with our ed prep providers, and there are multiple opportunities for them to revise and improve their programs, and we'll share that with you along the way as we go. Another effort that we've engaged in that those of you who've been on the board for a while will be very familiar with is a review of our approach to candidate assessment. And that started quite a while back. Several years ago, we had a set of practice exams for which we did not require the score that was recommended by the national panel that reviewed the assessment. In fact, it was 1 or 2 standard deviations below that recommended score. So we did a review of our practice exams. We looked at how it would impact supply and demand. We looked at the relationship between our cut scores and educator effectiveness, and we recommended raising all of those scores that were below that nationally recommended cut score to the nationally recommended cut score, and that has been implemented.
Question on that.
Yes.
So I've heard from several, a couple of the preparation programs in Memphis specifically about this, and how it affects supply and demand. And there were questions, at least from their perspective, that that for whatever reason, African American teachers have had a hard time passing, and so in a community like Memphis, that creates an issue in terms of filling opportunities in classrooms, and so. Secondarily, when we met with the Gibson County area superintendents, was it Gibson? Yeah. There seems to be an issue there as well, just in terms of being in those small towns and having limited supply, and how that impacts the classroom in terms of being able to promote teachers to higher level administrative positions, and not having someone to fill their place sort of keeps them trapped in the classroom. And so I just wanted to make sure that I understood this particular process so that when I get those questions, I can at least articulate what has happened and why and where we are on that.
So I'll start out, and anybody else who wants to
I'll
jump in,
jump in.
please do.
Not to take us into a long,
No,
different
no,
direction.
I
but
think this
just-
is part of the reason for the conversation this morning. So I think that we've thought about this topic, and I have we have an old presentation that I'd be happy to sit down and
Mhm.
walk you through with a lot of data on this topic. I think that there was a significant expectation that our teachers, all of our teachers, have demonstrated content knowledge in the areas that they were going to be responsible for instruction. And that one of the tools that we use for that is this nationally recognized Praxis Series assessment. And I think that, and I don't want to speak for the board members who are sitting right here, but the expectation was that if there is a national recommendation, that a panel that came together to develop an assessment made, that having a cut score below that was really not acceptable, because that panel was saying that if someone is going to teach, for example, math, they should have this minimum amount of content knowledge before they enter the classroom. And that, is for all of our teachers. I do think we have asked the question, and ETS has talked with us about the potential bias of the test. I know this is something that they are concerned with. They do studies related to this, and I think that you are correct that we do see lower pass rates among our candidates of color, and that is a significant concern for us. But it's one of those things where I think that our goal is to help candidates meet that expectation, and how can we provide support and services that will help meet that expectation. I know that the Trailblazers Coalition, which is a group here in Nashville of our educator preparation providers, are convening, and this is one of the topics that they are explicitly working on, is providing additional support to candidates who may be struggling with some of meeting these assessment expectations, which are more related to test-taking strategies or other issues and not related to content. And so it's exciting to see that work. I'm really interested to see where that goes, and whether it's something that we could replicate in a community like Memphis or any other community like Chattanooga in our state, where we struggle with the supply of our teachers. Anybody else want to?
I'll just jump in. I mean, I was definitely going to mention the Trailblazer Coalition work, because I think that's really important. And I think, we say Praxis, but there's actually sort of two big buckets of Praxis tests. And the Trailblazer Coalition has actually identified that Praxis 1, which is an entry test into the program, not the content tests that we're going to talk about in a minute, is also a barrier. So again, really thinking about how they can assist all candidates, but particularly candidates of color, in, just like you said, Amy, the test taking strategies, because it's really more usually about that than anything else. So there's a concerted effort happening across the state now that I think we'll want to support and build on to make sure that that's not the issue. But then secondarily, we're going to talk a lot more in a minute about some of these content assessments, which are called the Praxis 2 tests. And one thing this board has charged us with doing is really making sure that, especially in our core content areas, that we've done a really thorough analysis of those tests to ensure that they're aligned to our student standards. So that if we're holding this up as an expectation, for entrance into a classroom in terms of you have to show this content knowledge, we're really sure that that test is measuring something that we care about in terms of alignment to student standards. Because as Amy said, the data there is interesting. I mean, it's really, these content tests are really a check on sort of a basic knowledge base. They're not necessarily a predictor of effectiveness. So we want to be sort of cognizant of what role those tests are playing in our assessment of a candidate and their potential effectiveness in the classroom, and making sure that we kind of assess that accordingly.
So there's the pedagogy piece and the content piece, and we're kind of talking about the pedagogy piece, right?
Well, this bullet was really talking about
Everything.
everything.
Praxis 4
Is
a mix. Praxis 2 is the
content.
Okay, so Praxis core. And we had a cut score, and yet we have a great deal of concern as to if these EEPs are adequately training teachers on how to read. How did they get past that cut score, or how did they do well on that on the pedagogy piece when, how do we reconcile that? Reading's tough. They're not coming out feeling they've been prepared to teach reading, and they do good in that.
Well, I would say that's why we're going to talk in just a moment when Amy Owen presents on what we've done to look at the reading test and make sure we've got the right reading test on the books. And I think also EdTPA, which I think you're going to talk about here briefly,
I am.
is also more reflective of sort of the practice of teaching through that content lens. So that gets at the reading component as well. But I would argue we probably haven't had all of the right sort of checks on sort of literacy and reading. But part of what Amy's describing, the literacy standards for preparation, and then making sure we've got the right assessments that are sort of rigorously, evaluating a teacher's reading skills is where we need to go.
I'll,
We haven't always
I'll
been there.
wait and see what's coming. I don't know. I'm sitting here talking about stuff that.
Yeah, and this part is sort of an
Is in
overview of some of the
episode
things we're
4.
going to get into.
Yes. But, yes, we will want to revisit that in more detail. Another major shift that we made was explicitly related to the way that we assess pedagogical skills. And we are in the process of moving away from accepting the principles of learning and teaching, which is a multiple choice praxis assessment, and moving to EdTPA, which is a portfolio base that is also directly related to the endorsement area that you're being prepared to teach. 8 of our preparation providers have been engaged in EdTPA for many years and highly endorse this assessment. And it is the biggest piece of feedback that we get that I think is most important is our candidates tell us they hate it when they're going through it because it is a lot of pressure and a lot of burden. But once they are in that classroom as first-year teachers, they see the value of having gone through that. And I think that at the department, we see more and more there are connections between preparation for the EdTPA and then subsequent things that are happening in our schools, especially related to things like some of our portfolios that we have our early teachers complete now as a part of their evaluation process, and other opportunities for connecting that work directly to what happens when somebody becomes a teacher. Just to wrap this up, the EdTPA will become a mandatory requirement on January 1st, 2019. So right now, people can still take the PLT, but a lot of our providers are actively moving forward in using the EdTPA. I know the board has done some work, and the department will be doing some review this spring. We'll get a major influx of scores this spring from many more of our providers once their candidates complete the EdTPA, and we will really want to examine those scores and look at how our candidates are performing, and we'll bring some of that information to you.
Are we continuing to get some pushback on that timeline?
Yes.
And just, I guess my question, I knew we were, how much pushback it were,
Well,
and particularly where the legislature is going to get involved in that.
well, that I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't heard
They have not.
anything.
Yeah, there hasn't
It
been.
has
Okay.
not
No.
been a topic.
No.
Good.
The implementation of something like the EdTPA, if you do it well, often is requiring our providers to really reconsider how they are structuring and implementing their programs. And so they're doing this. And, what we hear most often is, well, those 8 providers had like 8 years to do this work, and we're getting 2 years to do this work. And so it is not anti-EdTPA. It's just we need more time, and this is a learning curve for our faculty, and our candidates are the ones that we're worried about, because if we haven't had time to get where we need to be, and they then don't, I think that they're feeling that pressure.
And
So-
feeling, I was just double checking because I think this went to you as well as to me, but TALACTI, it's a long acronym. Tennessee Association of Independent Liberal Arts Colleges of Teacher Education. That's a mouthful. Has submitted to me and to you sort of their position that they think, again, this is moving too quickly, and as colleges that are independent from the TBR system and UT system that had done more of this earlier, they are not happy with the timeline. So
That's right.
want to make sure the board knows that, and we'll be sure to share that with you as
So
well.
why does this have to be tied to the 7-year cycle? Why don't we say to everybody, all right, you don't have till 19, but everybody's got to be on board by 20. Everybody, period, paragraph. Yeah, you're going to have to work, but everybody. Because we're really doing this for prepare teachers not to be accommodating to these colleges.
So you're proposing like extend for a year? Because right now it's a requirement starting next January in
All right,
19, and it's not really tied to the
for
review
how
cycle.
many?
For everyone.
So I thought you said that. So,
8 have been using it for quite a while. And so the remaining, the expectation
Oh,
was
heck.
by 19 that they come on
they
board.
just need to get real. By the way, I got
I've also
Johnson
heard-
University coming to beat on me.
I've heard what Amy was sharing as well, that those who've been doing it for a long time are very realistic about their portrayal of what you can expect because they did it on their own. And it has taken them a long time to get to where they can achieve the cut score that we established. And so even with that being said, with their years of experience, they're still losing students that they think are great candidates for teaching, but that's just to say, we're losing some. We cannot recommend them. They will not get their license or whatever the case may be. But I think it's a real concern. And so I live in the real world. I think we all live in the real world, but we don't live in their world. And so we don't know what it takes to get there. So I've been concerned from the beginning. I voted, and I didn't have the benefit of hearing more realistically from those that are living this and breathing it day in and day out. And so I think it does bear us assessing the timeline. I really do.
Okay, so let me do the opposing deal. There are 44 teacher prep programs in Tennessee. You kind of got to wonder, that's a lot. So why is that? And to teach engineering, it costs a lot of money. To teach chemistry, to teach accounting, it costs a lot of money. A college can, out in wherever, can get into a teacher prep program cheap, charge the same amount of tuition as they do for the engineering program or the chemistry, where they're having to pay those guys. They may be paying, populating their faculty with adjuncts and still get the same level of tuition. These students, though, are paying the tuition, oftentimes taking out loans. And they expect to walk out the door fully prepared to walk into a classroom as a functioning professional. If we're going to side on, I understand that this is colleges get burdens put on to them all the time, including well, right now, what we have done has never reached above the deans. It never has gone to I don't think, to the provost, or oftentimes the ones I've talked to hadn't gone to the provost, hadn't gone to the president. And they don't know that they're really up against a brick wall. So that, they slow walk it. Now it is a hard date and they got to work to it. I don't have sympathy for it. I think that they need to, if they're going to be in the business of EEP, and that is providing a skilled graduate, then they got to do what they got to do.
I don't think at all that we ought to back off the 2019. I guess I'm a strong proponent that a lot of this action that we want to happen doesn't happen until it has to happen. And, I understand the pushback we're getting, but I think if we start delaying this, the next request would be to delay it another year and another year and so forth. So I think it's just so important that we move forward with this. In fact, when we set up 2019, I was arguing that that was too far out in the future, that we needed a shorter date instead of a longer date. So I'd hate to see us back up on the 2019.
I'm not going to pontificate, but I do disagree, and I respect your opinions on this. And I think we'll just have to see what the consequences are, because we talk about the pipeline, and there are real consequences to the pipeline. We have a major issue in this state, it's across the country, and I'm not advocating that we're not properly preparing our candidates to be effective teachers, and I know that this is the answer to that. And it's no excuse that a university can graduate an engineer who takes 2 years to come up to speed when they leave the College of Engineering at a university. That's the reality. So it's not just in education, it's across the board. So there, to me, in my mind, I can say whatever I want to say in this room. I don't walk in the shoes of a president or a provost or a dean, but the reality is there are changes that they need to make. They need to look themselves squarely in the face, just like we need to. And in any position I've ever held in my life, question, examine, dig in deeply, find out what the best practices are, learn from others, and figure it out so that you're successful. Your group, your department, your company is successful. And that's true here. And I don't disagree that we need to be pushing the envelope, but the reality is, I don't know that they can move that fast enough. I think they can put all the right things in place, but transformation in reality takes more time. That's just the reality. So we'll stick to our guns, we'll keep with the date, and we'll just see what the reality is, what the repercussions are. And I think that's what we have to deal with. So that's my pontification. I didn't mean to.
If I could just add a little
Yes.
bit of data input here, we do collect at TPA scores when we do the data collection for the report card. So we have a couple of years of data from those institutions that Amy mentioned that have been doing at TPA for a couple of years. What we've seen is that over time we've seen pretty dramatic increases. I'm looking at my data right here. For the first cohort, so the people who finished in the 13-14 academic year, the average at TPA score across all completers was 43.5, which is above our cut score, but not by all that much. But by the third year, the average at TPA score is over 46.5. So across those schools that have been doing it for several years, that's a pretty significant 3-point improvement over just 2 years. So for what that's worth, I think it might be worth considering, rather than changing the January 19 date for that to be a requirement, but potentially considering whether we want to have that 42 be the cut score right away rather than delaying implementation of EdTPA
Oh,
altogether.
no, I'm not advocating delaying.
Okay.
It's the cut score.
Well, we will certainly come back
Good
to this
feedback.
in more detail, because I think you're right. I mean, I think the important thing is for people to start using the exam, and then I think we can have a separate conversation about sort of what that means for cut scores. All right, in the interest of.
Well, I would just jump in and say another option is just a phase in, where again, you're doing full implementation, but we do this in other areas of our work in education, where you do phase in how that actually counts over a shorter period of time, and it allows people to get comfortable with what the expectations are and change programmatic pieces to align with those expectations. So I would put that on the table as we look at our data to determine if that's useful. I'm in agreement with the chairman, though. Sometimes doing that now doesn't make sense, right? See where you are in terms of your data and then make that decision once you see the data.
Okay, Amy?
We'll move on, but I do want to say that we also, though, have been providing tremendous amount of support to our providers. Our evaluation services that facilitates that support has a dedicated individual who comes to many of our campuses, offers trainings, and so I do think that there has been a lot of support. So I just wanted to say that before we move on. Data and accountability. This may be the most exciting part of some of our progress to date. We, as I've mentioned, have developed a comprehensive review process. It takes place once every 7 years. That includes direct expectations related to identified outcomes. Those are those CAPE standards I mentioned before. Our Educator Preparation Working Group has developed rubrics for 2 of the 5 standards. In addition to that, the annual reports that we will go into in much more detail are a set of quantitative measures that we collect and then report on annually, and then they are directly tied to the standards used for the comprehensive review process. So not only do we look at that data annually, but we also look at it summatively as a part of the comprehensive review process. We have also developed these annual performance reports, and as we've mentioned several times now, the annual reports, one of the primary reasons we wanted this tool was so that we did not have to wait a full 7 years if we saw results that were concerning. And so the annual performance reports may result in an interim review, and we'll talk about it in more detail again after the break. But if a provider is below expectations for 2 consecutive years, they will be engaged in that interim review process. So we'll talk about that more detail later. In addition to that, we also developed an annual insights tool. So as we've been committed to having higher expectation for our providers, we also wanted to be equally committed to supporting continuous improvement. And you may recall that one of the priorities that we set for the annual reports was that they provide our EPPs with actionable data. And the insights tool is that component of the annual reports that allows them to disaggregate their data by program area, by clinical type, and really helps them figure out where they need to dig in and make very specific improvements. We had that for them last year, and we have that for them again this year. The performance report is the place where we set those thresholds and determine whether or not they meet expectations. This is a major leap for our providers and something that we have gotten tremendous positive feedback on. I think that they are very excited about having all of this data at their fingertips. And one of the things that our providers do say is that while many of their colleagues in other states struggle to meet Standard 4 on CAPE because of the data requirements, it's something that we are making fairly easy for them to present. Now, it's up to them what that data looks like, but we provide the vehicle for that. And so we've gotten a lot of positive feedback about that. Our last summary slide is focused on research and technology. In 2015, we really didn't have any dedicated resources focused on research related to educator preparation. And we also had no platform to manage our approval process or track and report information related to educator preparation. As I mentioned, a lot of times it was paper-based, it was binders, it would be a website that the provider would create, but it wasn't anything that was standardized. As you likely will recall, last spring we published Preparation Through Partnership, which looked statewide at the supply and demand issues and the quality of those teachers that we were producing. And identified some real, and I have copies of that here if any of you haven't had a chance to see a copy. And it really focused on the need to develop partnerships between our educator preparation providers and the districts that they serve. And as I've mentioned, we have supported a network related to building those partnerships and really have seen an improved and elevated engagement between our EPPs and their districts. In addition to that, we also were awarded an IES grant. It was actually a grant that totaled about $7 million, but approximately 3.5 of that $7 million was dedicated to what they titled Educator Talent Management. And through that grant, we have developed, and we will share with you and show you today, what we call TN Atlas, and it is a platform for our educator preparation providers. It's where they will submit all of their evidence. It's how we delivered our annual reports. It'll help us analyze what our educator preparation providers are doing and how that's related to their ability to produce effective educators. It's tracking data at a level that we haven't been able to do before. Not just that quantitative data, but now we'll be able to begin to look at how are they constructing their clinical experiences, for example, and look across providers to help us inform how we set expectations for that. In addition to that, we, as a part of this grant, are also conducting some significant research to examine the effectiveness of educator preparation. We've been working with the Matt Ronfeld at the University of Michigan. He has done a lot of work for us to analyze this data that we have in our annual reports and some of our other data, and has done some preliminary work that demonstrates that there is a difference in terms of where you get prepared to be a teacher right now in our state. And our top quartile producers produce teachers who are more like second-year teachers compared to our bottom quartile producers. And that's a huge difference for students, and something that we want to continue to explore and understand what's driving that. A second major component of this research that we are doing, and again, we'll spend a little bit more time giving you a few details about that later, is taking a look at the clinical mentor. And you mentioned earlier about how some of our teachers have concerns about having a candidate in their classroom. So we want to explore that, and Matt Ronfeld again is going to help us look at some of that data of what is the impact of having a student teacher in your classroom. I'll come back to what you said about the realities. We don't know what the reality is. I'm not hosting a candidate in my classroom, and that probably does add some pressure, and we want to acknowledge that and really better understand it. And internally, we've even talked about how can we create incentives and opportunities for that to be a positive experience for our clinical mentors.
Yeah, we did have one initial study on this, and I was thinking, Victoria, you were probably involved in it from THEC's side and led it, where we reached out to SAS and did an analysis of what do we know about the student-teacher impact, and it was not negative. That's a posted report that, you know, SAS actually shares, and we've shared pretty widely. So just wanted you to know the initial research on this has not shown a negative effect, and we've tried to share that wherever we can. In fact, there's some positive effect as well. And so we're looking forward to what Matt Ronfeld actually does in terms of a second dig in on this topic.
Meaning for the classroom teacher
That's
record,
correct.
you know, you get pushback from districts saying, we don't want to let student teachers in because of the accountability for the classroom teacher, but that's not playing out.
I can still see where a teacher would think, I'm about to hand this over, my future, I can see where they'd be hard to persuade.
And Amy, I think you're going to talk about clinical or mentorship and partnerships, because I think part of it is making sure that the model for student teaching looks a little different than what we probably think of. It's not best practice to hand over the classroom to the student teacher. I mean, it's a co-teaching model where from the beginning of the school year, you're in there together. So in that scenario, you've got extra help as opposed to relinquishing control. But I think that's still a common conception.
And there are a lot of opportunities to think about different types of incentives for these clinical mentors that might not be just financial, in terms of things like release time.
Planning time.
A lot of things go into doing something like that, but I think there's some good work to be doing there. We're also, though, thinking about how do we train and prepare these folks to actually support their candidates, because right now, a lot of times our ed prep providers are giving them some sort of orientation that tells them what is your role, what is your responsibility, but that doesn't mean you know how to be a coach or how to help someone really develop, and we're kind of just asking our best teachers to just figure it out. And so we're engaging in some work to say, what would it look like if we put some expectations around that and help provide some additional support for mentors. So we'll close out, I think, I'm trying to watch my time, this segment, but we wanted to share a few perspectives from the field, and I'll let Amy share these two.
We pulled these from two recent articles. One was from UT Martin's president talking about the teacher prep report card that came out in February. And they're a really great example of a program where they weren't thrilled with their data this past year, but they're learning from it. They're eager to see what areas do they need to improve upon. So we think that's one of the really positive goals of our public report card that Spencer will talk about in just a little bit, in conjunction with the more detailed data from the annual reports, is that it's spurring these conversations at ed prep programs. And also a quote from Indira from SCORE, who's right over here. She wrote a great blog blog post talking about the teacher prep report card and some of the specific highlights that it noted in terms of the way the state prep programs are moving in the right direction. So y'all can read those, and we'll certainly have the slides for you after this, but we did want to highlight both of those articles that came out recently. And you can go ahead. Then we also have two quotes. One is from Mike Kraus. Y'all know him here at THEC. And he was looking at really how the last several years we've seen a lot of progress in collaboration between ed prep programs and the state and districts, and that everybody's focused and moving in the same direction of ensuring that we all have great teachers in our classrooms. And then one more, Amy, you gathered this one, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
So the last quote is a very generous quote from Renee Murley, who's the current director of the School of Education at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. She has been a part of our educator preparation working group, and I think that she just reflects here the support that the state has been providing to our educator preparation providers, and that we want to continue to provide in their support in their efforts to improve.
Just a side note too, there was a great article that she was quoted in extensively that came out over the weekend in the Times Free Press about, again, in Hamilton County, how UT Chattanooga has not always had the data that they want to have in terms of the report card, but they are using it really actively to make program improvements, and their partnership with the district is taking on a priority. So it was, and again, I think another example of how this data and the conversations that we're having across the state are really motivating the right kind of conversations locally and changes.
Yeah, I would say they're a great example, and there may be others that we could point to that are also taking the literacy components very seriously. And they've reached out directly to me, and we're having conversations about how they can think through some of their literacy preparation with curriculum choices that they make for their teacher prep candidates that better reflect what the field is using, and to create some tight ties there. So looking forward to what they're doing specifically, because they've really taken this data and run with it. We have some other pockets where we're starting to see some real insight with the districts and how they're using it.
Great, thank you. We appreciate Amy and Candace leading us through this review of the last several years. I'm just going to briefly set up our presentation on licensure assessments, and then we'll move on in that direction.
Good. Well, appreciate that review. I think that, sometimes we don't think we're getting much done, but when you put it all out there, it seems like over the last 3 years or so, we've really done a whole lot. So appreciate that review.
This presentation is a recap and an update on something we looked at the last time we were together in November, which was a review that our staff did in conjunction with the department of licensure assessments in the areas of elementary reading and secondary math. So I'm going to do a quick overview of what happened with those two reviews and where we currently are in terms of recommendations. And then I, along with Amy, will give you some updates on what the department is currently doing to look at other areas of licensure assessments. As a reminder, this is specifically looking at those content assessments, those Praxis 2 assessments. So not your pedagogy, not do you know how to teach, but do you know the content area that you're supposed to be teaching. We specifically looked at elementary reading and secondary math because obviously elementary reading is a huge focus in our state, and not only elementary school teachers take that test. Special education, English learner, ESL teachers, and middle school teachers also take it. So it really affects a broad swath of teachers. And then secondary math, we've of course noticed some shortages across the state in teachers of secondary math. So we wanted to be sure that if we have a test that's a pretty significant bar to entry, that it's meaningful and it's aligned with things we're concerned about. So that's why these two got priority. We had committees of about 12 educators, both at the K-12 level and in higher ed, meet to review each content area last August. So that's about 12 each, total of 20-odd folks. And ETS and Pearson are two of the most common test vendors for these sort of teacher licensure assessments. They were both kind enough to provide both all the publicly available material about their tests as well as live operational test forms, which was very exciting. It was really good that we were able to see those and not just, sort of a framework or a breakdown of what the questions would be like. We had reviewers who used rubrics that were based on state standards, and that's really key. We heard from both test companies that they've seen other states review the tests, and their rubrics were more things like what bells and whistles are provided, where are the test centers, how much does it cost, what are the study materials like. And those things are important, but they're not our baseline. Our baseline is, are they aligned with Tennessee academic standards and expectations in the classroom? After we did these reviews, we put together sort of brief memos summarizing what each group of reviewers found and what they recommended, and we shared it with additional groups of stakeholders for feedback last fall. So we were getting a little bit more broad feedback on these recommendations. So I'll dive right into elementary reading. As y'all remember, we reviewed 2 assessments each from ETS and Pearson. They're listed here. I have a more detailed breakdown in a handout. We talked about it in November as well if you're interested, but the summary was that the reviewers honestly weren't thrilled with any of the assessments. They found that none of them were aligned with the rigor and depth of Tennessee's revised academic standards and the literacy EPP standards. So what they recommended doing, ETS is already in a process of revising the reading assessment that we currently use in Tennessee. It's called Praxis 5203, Teaching Reading Elementary Education. They, on a cycle, review each of their assessments, and they happen to be reviewing this assessment right now to make changes to it. So what we did is we asked ETS to come to the department and the board in December. We had a meeting with about 20 staff people from across our 2 agencies, people who focus on ed prep, who focus on literacy, who look at academic standards content, a really broad swath of experts, and had them look at the revisions ETS was planning to make to their assessment. And it was not an easy session. ETS was very receptive to our feedback, but nobody pulled punches. People were very clear about what they expected to see in an assessment and ways that the revisions did and did not meet their expectations. So we've been continuing to work with ETS. Our teams actually have a phone call with them on Monday to ensure that the revisions they're making are bringing their test more in alignment with what we expect in Tennessee. So based on that update on the design process, Amy and I are going to sort of tag team this. Do you want to share a little bit more about the current thinking at the department regarding this policy area?
Yes, so I think that in terms of reading, you don't do only, right? We're not going to talk
Correct.
about the rest of the elementary right now. I think that the current thinking from our perspective is that the value of creating a customized test weighed against waiting to see if the revised test is more in line with what we need is we lean toward waiting to see if this test comes close, because the development of a customized test would in itself take at least 18 months. And so if we can get if we can feel that the revised test comes close to meeting our needs, that will be a much more swift implementation. So that's where our recommendation is leaning at the moment.
And so with that, you might have the question of what does the board need to do about this? At the moment, nothing. It's the same assessment that we currently use. When the revised version is launched, and you guys know more about this than I do, ETS will conduct a process to identify what a recommended cut score would be. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So they, and I'm not entirely positive exactly where they are in this process. So I would hope that that panel would be convened this spring, but I think it will depend on how quickly they can finalize the revisions to the assessment. But then they make a national call for recommendation for panel participants. We will certainly include some folks from Tennessee on that panel. And then that panel will come together, review the test items, determine what they would recommend for the cut score. Again, I think one of the things we can ask on Monday is when they anticipate that happening, so we could know when we might be able to bring a recommendation to the board for that test.
And the recommendation at that time would be an update to the professional assessments policy regarding the cut score for this.
Well, it would be a new, it'll probably be
yeah.
a new test, actually. Yeah.
So when will the new test be available for use?
My understanding is that they are aiming for this coming fall 18.
That's what they told us in December.
I'm eager to talk to them on Monday, because if they haven't finished the test and haven't convened the panel yet, I'm curious if they think that that's still feasible. It may very well be, but that's something that we can certainly share with you in an update if there is any change to when they will be able to implement that test. And part of that, though, I think is perhaps their effort to work with us to make revisions. So
I think that's where I'd love for, again, the board to weigh in and give us your feedback, because this is sort of where we've kind of found ourselves, is that reading is obviously the most, if not one of the most important areas as a state that we want to make sure we've got the right sort of content check for candidates. And the existing tests by our educators' appraisal do not meet that standard. This test has some promise. I mean, we did give them hard feedback when they came in December, and I think they were taking that very much back to their team to try to incorporate as they're making revisions to this current sort of cycle of their reading test. But as we really considered, and we were very much on the table with, okay, what would a customized assessment mean for Tennessee? Because we're willing to put the money and the time in if we need to as a state, I think. But it is costly. It doesn't happen overnight, and will take at least 18 months from the time we say go. And then you have portability and sort of reciprocity things to figure out at that point too, in terms of, are we going to require it of everybody coming in from all these other states? There's
yeah.
some of that to figure out.
I'm also eager to talk about the other elementary assessment we did, because this is also informing our thinking about this reading test. Can we move into that?
Do you want to go straight to elementary and then
Do you
come back to
mind?
math? Nope,
I think
not at
because
all.
it's so connected. So the department also took a look at the other elementary content tests that we currently require. So the test that we currently require is a general content knowledge test. It covers all of the 4 core academic subjects, but it does not have a subtest score. And that has been we've had some critique about the fact that we don't use this multiple subjects test. And so we had our internal TDOE content experts take a look at this test, and I have to tell you that I was very pleased with what they came back with. They are very much in favor of the multi-subjects test. They felt that it was rigorous and in 3 of the 4 areas highly aligned with our Tennessee standards. And in fact, they found that the reading component of the multi-subjects test was very strong. And this is that group that was extremely critical of ETS in the room, well, 4 of those folks. And so I think it shows that there's some real promise in adopting that multi-subjects test. The other thing that they recommended was that in terms of the EdTPA, we currently allow elementary candidates to take one of 3 options. You can take a standalone literacy EdTPA, a standalone math EdTPA, or a combination that includes literacy and math. And they recommended the combination literacy and math. And they felt that together, the multi-subjects reading test, the EdTPA, and hoping that the reading test, once it's redesigned, is better aligned with our standards, would be a complementary set that would make us feel comfortable with where we are in terms of assessing content knowledge of our elementary candidates.
So who makes the decision as to reading alone, math alone, combo?
Currently, it is an option, and so the EPP and the candidate make the decision, but as the board, we can revise the policy to clearly require the combination. Or
Just
you
one
can.
other note too. I mean, we talked with Kate Walsh, who's at the NCTQ, the National Center for Teacher Quality, and she has an extensive team there that looks nationally at sort of what tests are really rigorous, and they have a high bar, and she was really high on this subject-specific elementary test as a way to really get at reading, especially in elementary grade. We'll need that other reading test to make sure other teachers in special education and middle school and high school even have a reading assessment, but for what that's worth, they really think that having the sub scores, and they're one of the groups that has given us critique for not having that in the past.
And the way that that test operates, it's a cut score on each area, so it's
Like
not
ACT,
an overall
you'd
score.
have a sub score.
That's right.
Candace has said a number of times, math is a reading test.
So the end result, and let me make sure I'm clear here, would be the multi-subject praxis, the EdTPA on both reading and math, and the then the reading, the 5023 in addition to that, so it'd be,
Well, so that's currently what they take.
Yeah.
They currently take that general content test. They currently take an ed TPA, and they currently take, what one did I leave
Reading
out? The
test.
reading test. And in addition to that, they take a content instruction and assessment test as well. There are a lot of tests for the elementary folks.
And so just backing up, just to clarify this slide, I think y'all probably understood this, but I listed on the left the current requirements for our elementary educators. The one in bold is the one that we've been discussing, this sort of multiple subjects all-in-one content knowledge test. And as Amy said there, you get one score. And so if, personally, I'm more of a social studies and English kind of person, a high score in those areas could have covered up for me in weaknesses in math and science, or vice versa, depending on somebody's strengths. With the multiple subject test, as Amy said, you get a score for each subpart. So I'd have a science cut score, a math cut score, social studies, English language arts, in order to be licensed. And I think that's also useful when somebody goes to hire for their elementary team. They might be able to say, well, Amy's really strong in math and science, Michael's better in English language arts and, reading and social studies. How can we pair them together to complement each other in planning or in mentorship, or I know where you need coaching. So there are some benefits there beyond just that moment of taking the test. It could also help as they're entering the classroom.
okay?
Okay.
Thoughts on that before we move to secondary math?
What,
I want to make sure I understand the revision test is specifically related to 5018. Is that right?
No. So there is an existing multi-subjects test
Okay,
that we don't currently use.
Right.
So the transition to that would be, we generally give about a year so that the providers can change the expectations for candidates, who are in the pipeline. So usually we make that change effective like the next July 1 or something along those lines. So that's what would happen. The test that's under revision is the reading assessment.
Right. Okay.
We're lumping these together because
Yes.
we've been looking at the reading test, but then additionally, we're now looking at elementary tests
Okay.
and suggesting we
Regards,
also make
yeah.
this other change.
Yep.
And I think that what makes it feel really good is that those two end up sort of complementing each other. That if there's a revision to the reading test and we feel it's almost but not quite there, having this reading specific subtest gets us all the way to where we need to be so that they'd be working in conjunction. That's why Amy wanted to go and put these two things together. Does that work for y'all? What do you think of that?
sounds like a good plan to me.
I think so too.
Yeah, I don't,
And I think we still
Yeah.
would reserve the right to change our mind if the reading test in its
Yeah.
revised form comes back and it still really doesn't meet our expectations. Then I think we do have to really think about, okay, are we going to go down the
Oh,
customized route?
So what you talked to them about, and it's still got to go through the national sift, and it could come back to us not quite what we thought it would be.
Well, the national sift will just be about the cut score. I mean, we can set obviously whatever cut score we want, but I think the real question I have is the test itself going to be rigorous and aligned to our standards in a way that our sort of teams feel good about? And it was almost there, but we had some hard feedback for them in December because we didn't feel like it was all the way there. So they're taking that feedback, and again, you guys are going to talk on Monday. We'll see sort of where it nets out, but.
And they've been really eager to work with Tennessee. We have had several articles and things published recently highlighting the state and its growth in different areas. So I think I don't want to put words in any other company's mouth, but it's a little bit of a feather in the cap. If something is, positive and it's received well by Tennessee, that only helps nationally.
okay.
All right.
One question, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Will the same group that reviewed the prior test review the revision? Am I getting that correct?
Yes. So the
Okay.
same team at this point, it's just our internal, again, department, sort of more experts in the field and the state board. But we had a lot of educators and higher ed educators involved in the initial review. And they were the ones that told us that the existing tests, none of them were working to their mind.
And so then we'll look at secondary math, and this is also going to have an area where we'd like you all to weigh in terms of recommendation. In secondary math, currently, candidates can take 3 different assessments. If you want to teach just middle school, you can take the Praxis 5169 Middle School Math. If you'd like to also add, Amy, you give me a look. Is that okay?
You
Oh,
think
I didn't even know my face changed.
Okay, so I was like, did I get a number wrong? If you would like to also be able to teach Algebra 1, so for example, if you're in a district where some folks take Algebra 1 in 8th grade, you can take a specific assessment to add that to your license. And then if you'd like to teach 612, the full gamut of math, you take that the Math Content Knowledge Assessment 5161. So the reviewers in this area looked at those 3 assessments. They also looked at 3 complementary ones from Pearson, one that's just middle school, one they call middle grades and early secondary that would get you up through that Algebra 1 license, and then one that would be 612. In middle school math and Algebra 1, the reviewers recommended that the state adopt specifically the Pearson middle grades and early secondary test, not just the middle grades math. They honestly didn't think particularly much of the middle grades assessments, only generally. But they found that this middle grades and early secondary test was very strong, very aligned with Tennessee standards, and it would allow somebody to get through one test, a license that would cover grade 6 through Algebra 1 or Integrated Math 1. So that seems like a positive. It could be one fewer test for folks, and it would be easier for a district if people had this endorsement already and they said, wow, we really do want to offer Algebra 1 in 8th grade. We've got some kids that are ready for it. I don't have to go get a teacher to take an extra test. I don't have to go find somebody who's high school certified. My folks in my building could be able to do this. Secondary math, they also recommended the Pearson assessment both for its rigor and alignment to Tennessee standards. One sort of nuance here was that they found that the Praxis math assessment was also very rigorous. One needed to know difficult math in order to pass it. That difficult math was not necessarily aligned to the Tennessee state standards. So one thing, and this is where we're getting into your recommendations, one thing we've been batting around with the department is for secondary math specifically, for high school math, could it be a both and situation where a candidate could choose to take either the Praxis test or the Pearson test for that high school math licensure, with the logic that it's an area of shortage in the state, this could ease transitions for folks coming in out of state, and both of them would require candidates to know and be able to do hard math. It's just a matter of how aligned they are to Tennessee standards. We think it's important that things are aligned to Tennessee standards, we do, but we also think it's important to have qualified math teachers available to districts. So it's sort of in the way that we think about, a student can choose to take the ACT or the SAT and colleges accept either one. Would there be a world where we accept either the Praxis or the Pearson score? It is up to, this is what I'm curious to hear from this group. How does that strike you? Are you more interested in moving wholesale to the Pearson assessments? There's a couple logistical and communication challenges we'd talk through there. Or is anybody open to this both and scenario?
So question, what would be the downside of doing both?
That's a great question. Some things we've heard, we actually asked both test vendors just out of curiosity, and we know that, this is obviously their business. We take it through our own lens as well, that it can be confusing for ed prep programs and for candidates to think about, what am I getting prepared for? What do I need to know? What's going to be on this test? Probably it would get down logistically to where an ed prep program would say, we're really focused on preparing you for X. We recommend you take this assessment. Also, they've seen in other states that have tried this that, you get a year or two out from making that decision, and people start to sort of forget what the logic was behind it. And then districts or a board or the department want to know, like, well, what's the real score? Which test do I really care about? And then it can sort of lead to this ongoing conversation where every time we have to remember, why are we doing this again? What's going on here? Sort of a third way could be that we allow both for some set period of time, 1 year, 2 years, something like that. Analyze the data and see if we're seeing any really remarkable results, that candidates are passing one more than the other, that principals who hire candidates who took one test rather than another are thinking they're more prepared, get a variety of feedback along the way, and then see if we move to just one or the other. So there's a lot to take into consideration here. This would be the only licensure assessment in Tennessee where we used the Pearson assessment. They've been very open to conversations with us about, they've got test centers established around the state already for different assessments they give. They've been open about working with ed prep programs to create more of those on campuses. And they've been talking to Michael and Amy about how a data transfer could look. So logistical steps involved here. nothing necessarily insurmountable, but it would be a new thing for Tennessee. It would involve needing some really clear communication to our ed prep providers and our candidates about what's going on here, when is it happening, what do I have to do or not have to do. So yeah, that's sort of laying it all on the table, and I'm curious to hear what you think. Yes, sir.
Back up, please.
One more, or that good?
Right. So, back up again. Where was the math, high school math?
This
Secondary.
is it's the one that gets to high school is actually a 612 license, correct? Okay.
All right, so here's the questions I would ask whenever we were to, I want to know the questions I asked last time. We were voting on Praxis high school math, and I think the cut score was like 158, which turned out to be, for me personally, meaningless. There were 60 questions. You passed 34 of them right. You got endorsed to teach everything in the school. Algebra 1 through calculus. My question's going to be, I understand it's a rigorous test and that it covers the waterfront unless we hit that cut score to where we're only really getting about 2 miles from Daytona Beach. So I want to, you're going to have to walk through how a cut score determines where a student or a candidate should not be endorsed.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think you're right. This is the same conversation with any test in terms of what's the cut score telling you about sort of mastery of the whole body of content knowledge being assessed versus some portions of it. And I don't have a great answer for that because I think with any of these tests, I mean, the cut score does not necessarily mean that you have answered every question right? I mean, that's the point of a cut score. But I think, for me at least, what I try to do is, I mean, you've got the content test, and then you've also increasingly got this EdTPA test that is, again, how you can put that content knowledge into practice and documenting how you are in the classroom, through the content lens. So I think you have to think about both in terms of what information that's giving you on the front end, knowing that nothing's going to be perfectly predictive of future effectiveness. But we can certainly walk through as we get to a cut score what that means for the secondary math test.
The last time
But it may-
Praxis did not want to walk through it, and I had to go through a national deal to get those 60 questions and 125, and if you pass 52 out of chemistry, math, chemistry, biology. The truth is, here's what these tests tell me, that if someone has an endorsement in math, that means they've got an endorsement in calculus. I want to know they know calculus. And you all need to tell me how you all know that they know calculus. I understand the pedagogy piece, and I understand you can't, you can't be a great teacher without the pedagogy piece, but if you don't have the content knowledge, I don't think you can teach that course either.
Maybe there is a way that they can tell us at least, I don't know that there is, but for
The-
that upper level math, like, is this person demonstrating through this cut score that they have mastered the calculus piece?
On the Pearson score reports, they do actually break it down by the subjects and topics within the test. So they don't necessarily, that would not necessarily be the board recommended cut score, although I imagine we could think about that in some way. But that you would be able to see that there were, 12 calculus questions and a person got 11 right or 2 right or something else like that. And I think I'm recalling from recent conversations with ETS that they're trying to move in a similar direction with Praxis score reports. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I haven't
Okay.
heard that from ETS,
Okay.
but it may be accurate. What we've discussed in the past, and I think just as we're trying to figure out how to get through this, is that we've been reluctant to create, extremely narrow endorsements for math because you'll exacerbate our supply, that's already a massive challenge in secondary math. It could be, though, that we consider, and I'm just trying to put options on the table, some sort of tiered math endorsement where, if we move to the Pearson test that allows, someone to teach up through Algebra 1 and Integrated 1, you could have another tier that would have, I don't know, some sort of cut score, and then a third tier that would demonstrate, stronger mastery. One way that I was thinking about this while you were asking the question was about something like the GRE quantitative score that graduate programs look at. They're not expecting everybody to have a perfect score, but what they're looking at is for you to have a high enough score that they believe there's probable likelihood that you will be able to succeed in the quantitative components of that graduate program. And I think that that's the idea behind these assessments, is that the cut score should mean that the person has answered a sufficient number of rigorous questions correctly. And the way psychometricians work, they know if you get this question right, you're probably going to get those questions right. And so they're able to say at the level of the cut score that they believe that there's a probable likelihood that this individual has the content knowledge if they have the other skills necessary to be an effective educator. So I think that that's part of why we don't expect 100%.
But that's what I'm
on
wondering
a
too. I mean, do you
score.
think, based on your all's conversations with Pearson and ETS, that would be possible to get score reports? So not necessarily a different test, but score reports that would tier just what you described, sort of like, middle, like the middle part of secondary math, and then the upper level secondary math.
So I would not recommend moving to a place where the state is trying to disaggregate the data in a way that they don't present it.
That's
What
what
I
I mean.
think-
It'd be about the
What I
vendor.
think would be most simple would be to have, just 150 gets you this level, 175 gets you this level. Because to get 175, you're going to have to answer hard questions correctly. So you would have.
That's what I thought you were saying,
yeah,
but based on
yeah.
the same test.
I think so, because we
tiered
don't know of
scores.
another test that breaks apart the higher level math discreetly.
Just one question. So after a candidate takes the praxis, has a passing score, goes into the classroom, how long is it until they are evaluated where it counts towards the report card?
That year.
for the
That same year?
it's that same year for the teacher
Okay.
prep report card. Yes.
All teachers are evaluated annually for their own sort of
Right.
professional growth, but then, for our teacher prep report card, that first year counts for the prep program as well.
So if we did the dual option with both tests, is there a way to determine who took which test and how they performed,
Yes.
and then trace that back and see if that tells us anything about
Yes.
one or the other? And I would imagine if it's even, then that's probably a good thing. That
But it's only giving more people flexibility and
Right.
options.
exactly.
So,
And if it's not, we would know which test
one
to
person
move to.
takes a Pearson exam and gets a honors class, and another person takes Pearson math and gets a college prep class. So how are you going to distinguish between those two?
Do you want to talk more about what the data distinguishes? Like we can track which classes folks are taking. We can track characteristics of students, their previous growth and academic achievement scores before they were in that class. So we would want to try to make it as comparable as possible.
But would the data aggregate it that granularly in order to grade?
For
All right,
teaching.
Peterson's looking pretty good. Well, it looked pretty good for the honors class. I'm not so sure how it looked.
I gotcha.
It's a
So you mean if they're
That's
teaching
tough.
an honors class,
Mhm.
right?
That's really tough.
Yeah,
In the school.
one teacher gets assigned an
Right.
honors course, one
You-
teacher gets a college prep
Yeah.
class.
You're trying to make a connection to the correlation of course codes, which says that if you hold this endorsement, you could teach these courses. I think you'd have to have potentially two separate endorsements that you could receive, like an A or B. If you got this level, You'd get this endorsement. If you got this level, you got this endorsement.
And further, what are
And
they
then that
actually
would be
teaching?
connected to the courses through
Yeah.
the correlation of course codes. But that's, right now, that's a tough thing to
Well,
analyze.
one thing I hope we don't, I know we've done it in the past. I know we've absolutely have nightmares and not doing it. But I hope we never engineer a cut score in order to get enough people in the classroom. If we're short a math teacher and we put someone in there in calculus who doesn't know calculus, we're still short a calculus teacher. We got a human body to maintain the room, but that kid, it's not in the kid's best interest to have someone. That's what I want, because when you're thinking about math's not math. There's a big difference between even algebra 1 and algebra 2. There's a big difference in the in calculus and all the other maths. In fact, calculus really in a lot of ways isn't even math. But
So, in the interest of time today, could I just get, I'd be curious from each of our board members, what direction are you leaning in? Are you leaning in a go full sail to Pearson, to do a both and study it, or to a I need something more before I make a decision?
Yeah, I think the combination thing makes a lot of sense for the reasons you articulated. Basically, you get away from some of the reciprocity, you get a quicker implementation period, and I think then we could judge, go down the road as you suggested, 2 or 3 years, determine how that's working out, what are the problems, then decide whether you want to go one or the other. But I can't see much of the downside in going with the combination, at least test it for several years.
I agree. Short and sweet.
I don't disagree. I'm still kind of, I'm not
Okay.
sure I got it clear in my head, but I don't disagree.
Great, thank you. That gives us some awesome direction to be moving forward. And you will be hearing from us at upcoming board meetings regarding policy changes in that area. Last,
I'd be particularly
Go ahead.
interested in exploring with the Pearson that you can get feedback on the various levels, that, making sure we include an analysis of that and seeing what that looks like and whether that tells us anything.
okay, great. The final thing I was just going to note briefly before you guys can decide if you want to take a break or hear from Spencer shortly on the report card. At our November subcommittee meeting, we also mentioned a couple other areas to review. I wanted to give you an update that we did talk with the Special Populations Division about looking at the licensure assessments for special education. They really want to do sort of a holistic look at their licensing structures generally, to see if the way that they are have endorsements structured, if the way that they are kind of encouraging candidates to be prepared aligns with the current expectations for special education teachers, which really runs the gamut, as you know, from somebody who's doing interventions with students who may have learning disabilities to somebody who's working with students with much more significant cognitive challenges. So Special Populations is working with Amy's team to think big and broad, how does our licensing structure work for us? What are areas that we want to improve? And they want to get that in place before they start thinking about the tests, because it doesn't really make sense to say, is this test right for this license if we're not sure that the license is right for what we want folks to be doing. So just wanted you to know that that is in the works as well. And Sarah and I and others have been brainstorming as we move into the spring and summer ways that we can continue to seek feedback from districts and ed prep programs about what is and isn't working for them in terms of licensing structures. As you all know, last summer we heard feedback from a district and were able to act on it where they were having challenges with military spouses getting teacher licenses. We want to be able to surface any other issues like that where districts are having burdens that we may not be aware of in terms of licensing and what we can do about those. So that's our work moving forward. Does anybody have sort of final comments or concerns on this section? Great.
I think it's all important work.
Yes, sir.
Need to-
We're glad
And
to
I,
do it.
I guess particularly, I think we need to make sure we're addressing some of these issues that you identified of where somehow our whole licensing structure is standing in the way of getting the right people in the classroom. And I think there are, sometimes we've been too structured. in that, and we need to make sure that we're looking at the options that are out there and taking advantage of the good teachers that may be there that are prohibited from teaching for some reason.
Great. Well, we're a little bit over time. Would y'all care to take a break? We've been sitting for an hour and a half, or do you want to power through?
Take a break? Yeah, why don't we
break.
take a quick break here? We are a little bit behind, so, let's
5
make it real
minutes?
quick.
Yep, back around 10:40.
Yep.
Get you set up too.
Straighten down a little bit.
What? This thing being
They were saying that they think that there should be something more in-depth.
I think that our,
I didn't learn it. What are, right now, we talk about them anecdotally, but there's nothing we can do. We have stuff that. Whatever it is.
Spencer. Disregarded a file just in case questions come up.
now there's some other
And I needed to plug it in,
standards about all
so,
students, but
yeah,
what we
that's why
want
it's
to
up
do
here.
is
But
build that out.
this is
and
all
make it
desktop,
clear,
so.
And hopefully what the work
Okay,
that these
perfect.
three universities are engaged in will help define that for us. But I think you're asking a
Yeah,
really
and I'm gonna
critical
kinda
question
Yeah,
that we need to be
yeah.
able to answer.
fairly quickly through a few of the
Well, that was
slides.
just feedback from them that I was.
Folks already
And
kind of know.
Okay.
Any feedback you bring with us is incredibly valuable.
If you don't want somebody.
So, and the other thing I think,
Two things. One, are your concerns?
Oh, yeah. Oh my God.
This was
I
an
had
egg,
like
so-
a rolling mini bar with me.
Well, you could look in here. I've got peanuts to share from my work stuff. Thank you. That's first thing. What's second thing?
It looks like the bill that wanted to tie quality
You
assurance.
going back today?
Have you
Oh, yeah, of course you're going back. They got out of it.
I was gonna try to meet, I should meet.
Well, I'll tell you, when I came through Knoxville yesterday, it was
Snow.
snowing, man, I mean, it looked like a blizzard.
I was in DC. I missed the whole thing.
Yeah.
so Memphis teacher residency does not have independent state. They work
Or no?
just as an FYI, we don't review MTR as a standalone program.
I said, how
They're
are you
great
going to go
programs,
off
but
this committee?
But we don't review them.
How are we going to do
independently.
this without you?
It doesn't matter, but they're connected to, yeah, yeah. And that's
You have to
completely
be a board
appropriate.
member to be on a committee.
But I would encourage you to talk to the folks at University of Memphis. The dean there has been there now for a little over a year. But
After
she
talking
used
to
be
Joyce last
on the
night, she was
Tennessee
like,
board.
you know, he says, she
Clark?
says, he's still not gonna be mine.
I
He
can
still has
connect
all
you
these
with her
other
if that would be
boards.
helpful. And I have no doubt that she would be very interested in talking with you.
And I,
She's fantastic.
you probably
And
didn't
she's
detect
on
whether, she thought that was good or bad.
working with her.
Okay.
So she's very engaged with
So she
state
like
efforts.
dean of the education department?
Yeah,
or-
yeah.
Okay, so we're on an overboard, overtime.
Okay, are we ready? Spencer, you ready? Geared up? Okay, let's go.
All right, so I should be fairly quick today. We've got some small, mostly positive things to report about what's been going on with the report card recently. So obviously we did successfully launch it last month, so I'll just talk a little bit about kind of the launch and the early feedback that we've gotten, as well as a couple other things that we have in the pipeline. So just a quick review, recapping what we did for the 2017 Teacher Preparation Report Card. We wanted again to collect a lot of feedback, so we sent out a survey to stakeholders at the EPP level, at the school district level, and current candidates, so that we could get kind of perspective from all three different levels. We also presented at TACTI, which is the Tennessee Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, and TASPA, which is the Tennessee Association of School Personnel Administrators. And we spoke with them about different uses for the report card at both the educator preparation provider level and at the school district level. We also put together another advisory council for the summer last year that helped us with some of the particular changes that we made. And then we also, on the data side of things, collaborated more closely with TDOE to make sure that the annual reports and the report card really were as well aligned as possible. So in the data cleaning process, we worked together to make sure that the completer set that we were using was as close as possible as we could make it, and that the metrics that we were using and that they were using for the annual reports were also aligned whenever we could make that possible. And then finally, the last thing that we did this year was to make there a longer data review period for the providers. So we sent them a roster of everyone that we had listed as a completer from their institution, as well as which metrics they were being considered towards, and everything that wasn't personally identifiable and stuff that we have to keep confidential, we did share with them this year. So we got positive feedback about that, and then we also had a longer embargo period. So once the results were finalized, we gave them a week to sort of prepare for discussing the report card publicly when it was officially launched. And I think the only negative feedback that we've gotten there is that we were a little bit unclear about how long we would actually be able to make those this year, as we were trying to finalize the data and everything. So I think if we can establish those in advance next year, that would be the only thing that we could improve on there. But otherwise, I think people really did have a significant degree of confidence in the data that we were presenting this year, and I think that's very helpful for the work that we're trying to do with the report card. So just recapping the major changes that we made between the 2016 version, which was the first redesigned report card, and the 2017 version, we expanded the scope of the data that was included on the report card this year. So this was the first time that we had 3 cohorts of completers represented, so people who either finished their program or were serving as the teacher of record while in a job-embedded program during the 2013-14, 2014-15, and 2015-16 academic years. And then we also added a highlights page this year, so that'll include information on both the state focus, which this year was on partnerships and the work that our EPPs are doing with the primary partners that they work with at the district level, in terms of both making sure that pre-service teachers have opportunities to gain the experiences that they need, and then teachers in the classroom are also being supported. And then the institution section, focus section there, also allows them to talk a little bit about some of the other aspects of their institutional mission or particular programs that they don't think are being represented by the rest of the data on the report card. So we wanted to give them a chance to have a little bit more voice there, and that's also been well received. And we really did get a wide array of submissions there that allowed us to see some really interesting things that our programs are doing. And then the other major change that we made was for each scored metric, we added 1 level of disaggregation, so a breakdown that allowed people to dig a little bit deeper into the data. And then finally, a more minor change that we made was just for the providers that don't receive an overall performance category. So if they don't meet our standards of having at least 10 completers in more than half of the metrics in each domain, if you did meet the standard for a particular domain, you still received a performance category there. So some of our smaller providers can still see how their performance compares to other providers across the state. What we didn't change this year was the performance framework. So again, we had the three domains with 9 scored metrics, the same as we did last year. We kept the point distribution the same. So we had 20 points in the candidate profile section, 15 for employment, and then 40 for provider impact. And then at the metric level, we also kept the minimum standard and target the same. So those determine whether you get no points, partial points, or full points for a particular metric. And so just for this year, we really wanted the focus to be on sort of a set target that people could work towards. And we wanted to really highlight improvement on performance from last year. And so that's what we were able to accomplish by keeping those levels set at the same place for each metric. So we've talked about expanding that in the future and thinking about, do we want that to be every 3 years? As one cohort rolls off, we'll reconsider what the minimum standard and target is for each metric. But for this year, we really wanted to emphasize consistency, so we did keep the performance framework the same.
Spencer, remind me why we determined that in the domain candidate profile, ACT scores would be 3, racially and ethically, those scores. How do we determine those points? I
So-
don't remember asking that question before.
Sure. So that was something we worked really closely with the 2016 Advisory Council with. So we had them sort of take the points that we wanted to put on the report card and then distribute them both by the domain level. So of candidate profile, employment, and provider impact, where people felt they wanted to place the most emphasis. And then within that, how they wanted to weigh each of the metrics. And in candidate profile specifically, the ACT metric that we have there is the lowest weighted just because, first of all, a lot of our completers who are not undergraduates don't have an ACT score. And then I think the research basis for linking standardized test scores, particularly like the ACT or SAT, which people are taking when they're fairly young, to performance as a teacher isn't as strong as some of the other metrics that we have.
Right now, it's really just serving as a proxy for selectivity, and it's
Right.
not a perfect proxy. You know, are they recruiting and trying to get candidates who could, do a lot of things?
I thought 21 was required.
So to be admitted with your ACT score, you need a 21, but you can, if you don't have a 21 on the ACT, take the Praxis Core, which is sort of the equivalent assessment there. Yeah, and so we have the data from people who submitted ACT scores and Praxis scores, and some of them scored below 21, and that's how we get sort of the differentiation there.
Thank you.
All right, retention. Everything's in there, every reason somebody leaves. And
Yeah.
that really tells us what?
So I think the way we see that metric is that we're really only looking at the second year after you're placed in a school, whether you're remaining in a Tennessee public school classroom. So I think the way we see that is the EPP is still at that point really responsible for a lot of the training that determines whether or not somebody is able to thrive in a classroom. And so I think we would, in an ideal world, like to be able to go a little bit finer there, but I think that again, serving as sort of a proxy, we can at least see, okay, people who are placing teachers in Tennessee who are remaining in Tennessee. And I think that there's some value there because we actually are in the process of getting a rationale document on the research basis behind our metrics that we include on the report card up on the website. And you can really see that in the first couple of years that somebody is a teacher, that their performance significantly improves. So that's sort of what we're trying to capture with that metric.
The other thing there too, I mean, for all programs, they're going to have some candidates who leave because they got pregnant and are taking maternity, or so it's a relative measure across programs. And then you're also going to have people who were asked not to come back, but we just can't disaggregate those reasons because the state doesn't collect it.
Okay.
All right, so now going a little bit deeper into some of the changes that we made for this year. As I mentioned, this was the first year with 3 cohorts of data. And then since this was also the second year in this format, we were able to produce data over time, which is something I think we're really excited about. So that way we'll be able to see Last year, we were sort of just able to compare providers to other providers across the state, but now we really have sort of a baseline that we can use to judge at the metric level, at the domain level, and overall which providers are improving, which might not be moving in the right direction, and which sort of have become stuck at a level that we don't think is necessarily satisfactory, and what we might be able to do to improve that. But this graphic here shows overall the distribution of EPPs by performance category. The color coding is for 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the orange, yellow, blue, and green here. And then you can actually see by which percentage level they get in, so whether they're 10%, 20%, 30% of the total points earned. So we did shift the distribution a little bit to the right this year. So overall, people are improving. We had 8 EPPs score in a higher category this year than they did last year. And I think 18 out of the 30, in terms of just overall percentage of points earned, did score higher than they did last year. And then in particular, we really improved sort of the lowest level of our providers. All 4 that received a performance category score of 1 last year moved up to a 2 this year. And then 2 of the new EPPs that we were able to add with the 3rd cohort of data did score in performance category 1. So hopefully we can see similar improvement as we saw with the ones from last year on next year's report card. But I think we're really excited to be able to compare at those different levels performance over time. So then I already mentioned the highlights page. We don't have much more to add about that other than this year we did want to highlight partnerships as something that we thought that across the state all of our providers would really be able to speak meaningfully about, because that's really something that we kind of see as a state focus beyond just the board's work. And I think we really were able to get some really interesting information there, and I think we're hoping that that leads to some more conversations between the EPPs and their districts that they work with. We actually just met with Austin P and Clarksville Montgomery, was that a couple weeks now? A couple weeks ago, and had a really productive conversation about how they can work together to make sure that they're aligned in terms of the preparation and in terms of making sure that teachers who finish their preparation at Austin P are ready to go teach in Clarksville Montgomery. So we really wanted to emphasize that. That is something we do see changing on an annual basis to kind of reflect what we see as major issues across the state. One thing that we had considered using as our state focus this year and might do it for next year is literacy, just because that's also been a real area where we've seen a lot of movement, and I think we wanted to just give that another year to allow our providers to really implement some of the changes that they've been making, so that way they'll be able to speak on that more. But I think that's something where we're really open to input in terms of different things that you at the board would like us to be emphasizing there, because I think that's an interesting way for us to compare our providers beyond just the data that we have. Then the disaggregations were a major change. We did hear last year that people like the simplicity of just looking at the provider level, but we're hoping for a little bit more information publicly available. So for each metric, we chose one type of breakdown to include. The one that we used most frequently was this endorsement clusters breakdown, which we used for ACT scores, as well as retention and all of the provider impact ones. So that lets you look at by kind of groupings of endorsement, so similar area and grade band, how the teachers in that endorsement area did on that particular metric. And then we also have unique disaggregations for the percentage of racially diverse completers. We compared the EPP's percentages and demographics to those of the undergraduate student body at the institution that houses the EPP. So is your program at least as diverse as the student body at the institution that you're a part of? And then for high demand endorsements, we broke that down by the 5 high demand areas, so that you could see whether it's really special education that's driving those numbers, or who is doing a good job of producing those secondary math and science teachers that we sometimes have a hard time finding. And then finally with placement, that was another one we had a significant amount of pushback on, and we tried to find a compromise measure there to account for some of the discrepancies we're seeing in terms of people who are either near a border and going to teach in a different state, or going to teach in a private institution, or going back to graduate school. So what we did to somewhat account for that was put in a non-scored placement rate for just people who are listed as Tennessee residents. So that way we can take the people who seem to be more likely to put down roots here and really stay for a long time, and see how good of a job an EPP is doing with those students in terms of making sure that they become teachers in Tennessee and then stay teachers here.
One of the things I was talking to Amy about, this goes beyond the EPP. And we see the raw data and that tells us something. We see the analytics. What do we do with it is important. How do we change what that is, and how do we come up with specific action items, whether it is the legislature or the society or county commissions or we, I mean, if one of the things is we're putting way, which I hear all the time, that we're putting way too much administrative burden on teachers, and that is a barrier to either retention or getting into the to the major in the first place. We need to not only understand that, which I'd love to see those numbers, and I can't wait to see them. But then again, it begs the question: what do we do about it? I don't want to just information.
Well,
Knowledge.
I think that's the right question. I mean, I will say one of the things that's been really encouraging to me that Amy Wooten's team and our team and Mike Krause's team have been hosting are these sort of roundtable conversations with our EPPs, these education providers, so that we can have a chance to walk through both the report card and the annual report data, and at least sort of at the program level, what do you do with it? I mean, I think your question begs a deeper answer in terms of, collectively, what do we need to do at the macro level? But I do think the data has proven to be really actionable for the programs and for their partner districts. So I think that's a step in the right direction. But I think, there are bigger questions that we all have to wrestle with in terms of the workforce trends and just, the profession itself and how we attract people in, what kind of salaries we're offering, and how does that compare with, students' other options.
Yeah, and then Mike, to your point, I think this slide was sort of about how we're taking the report card itself and trying to expand upon that. So since the release, we did go to speak at TACTI, their conference, and gave a similar update on the overall changes and all that, and then had a separate breakout session where people got to discuss some of their specific feedback. And I think we did hear some helpful things that we can do differently about some of the metrics. I think there are some legitimate concerns about, in particular, the ACT metric. And I think in general, there's more that we could be doing to make sure that our EPPs feel that the data that we're presenting is as representative as it could be. But I think we also really, we see the value of the report card as being something that can introduce people to thinking about teacher preparation in a different way and can help facilitate conversations. So I have on here these additional meetings that we've been having. So we've already talked about the meetings that we've had with the university and the EPP leadership, and I think those have been really helpful. But beyond that, we've also, that meeting that we had with Austin P and Clarksville Montgomery, I think was a model that we hope to expand on in the future, because I think it was really helpful just getting people with those different perspectives in the same room and seeing how a lot of the initiatives that they'd already been discussing, I think, were supported by what the data showed in their report card. So I think that really, because this is publicly accountable data and something that's shareable to everyone, that helping it serve as sort of soft power is really something that we need to focus on more. And I think we are trying to expand the report card so it's not just something that comes out once a year. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my next slide. But I think that overall, we're trying to now take this, now that it's in a form that we feel comfortable with, and figure out how it can be useful to a lot of different people. And there doesn't have to be one answer there. We kind of see it as something that can have a lot of different roles in the larger work.
Let's not underestimate the value of just competition. And I guess that's what I'm hearing from these EPP providers. They're looking pretty much how they score versus others, and I think there's real value in that. Real value in that. Don't underestimate.
And then one new thing that we did this year, we partnered with SCORE on a mini campaign as part of their Teach Today, Change Tomorrow initiative, which is focused on helping encourage people to think about teaching as a profession for them. And looking at our analytics on hits on the website and everything, we definitely got a lot of referrals from the Twitter campaign that they ran. So we have a lot of people who haven't seen this before who are checking out the report card, and I think we're excited to build on that as something where people are seeing like, oh, this is new information that I have, and I feel a lot more confident building a career as a teacher more than just based off my own experience in the classroom and talking to my own teachers. So I think that there's a lot of movement there, but it's not necessarily tangible, concrete things that we're going to be changing right away. It's more helping influence conversations that'll lead to some of those more micro level changes. And so then just kind of wrapping things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about where we're going from here. So one thing that we're trying to do as part of our efforts to make it so it's not just about the launch in February with the report card is producing some follow-up reports. One area that we've really keyed in on for this year is diversity. I think we see that going in a couple different directions. One, I think we can kind of, in the format that we use for the data disaggregation, start to look at differentiation and performance on the different metrics in the report card and see how our teachers of color are doing on those compared to our white teachers. And then I think we also have heard that people are interested in seeing other types of diversity represented, and I think that this would be a great way for us to do that in a way that doesn't kind of detract from the scored metric that we do have on there to encourage our EPPs to recruit and prepare more teachers of color, but to really capture the different types of diversity across the state. So we've heard from THEC a little bit that it might be possible to get some Pell data there, Pell eligibility data to look at socioeconomic status. We'd also, I think, be interested in seeing what we might be able to report on first generation college students or people who have a language other than English as their first language, and kind of seeing how we can shape all of that into kind of a discrete report that we put out under the umbrella of the report card, but separate from the main website, and just as a larger tool so that people can really see that this data that we're sharing has a lot of different uses. And then we definitely plan to continue to meet with our EPPs. At the TASPA conference, we encouraged the districts to have a conversation with the EPPs in their area and said we'd be happy to facilitate any of that. And then finally, we're also working on kind of making the data collection process a little bit more efficient. So trying to draw in some more data from TN Compass and the licensure information that's already being uploaded, just to make sure that there's less busy work around the report card, so that way people might feel a bit more positively about that as well. So any questions about the changes that we made for this year, about what we're planning to do moving forward?
Go ahead,
Well,
Darren.
just one comment. I had the opportunity to meet last Thursday evening with a group of SCORE fellows from across the state, and they were very complimentary of the report card and thought it was
Great.
extremely
hear.
well done.
That's progress right there if they
Yeah.
know about it and have looked at it.
Yeah, yeah. So,
That's good.
It is amazing, you know, the feedback we're getting on this report card. You know, I've got a daughter who's a freshman at UT in education, and within a week, just several days of when we put the report card out, she sent me a note about where UT had scored. And, you know, I'm surprised as a freshman that, you know, a big program like that, you know, but somehow it gotten down to her. I'm also amazed at the national level. I'm getting as many from, you know, the National Assessment Governing Board. I'm getting as many questions about what we're doing here with this report as, you know, what we've done with NAEP and some other things. But, you know, it's a lot of national attention out there apparently on what we're doing.
I'm gonna set Spencer into stardom as he goes to pursue his PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually have heard from several other departments of education asking about our process here, so I think it is exciting nationally beyond just
And
what we're doing here.
and the focus seems to be on the outcome nature
Mhm.
of it, which I'm getting the impression from the questions being asked that that's pretty much unique in what's going on out there for the time.
It's a reminder that, you know, states outside of Tennessee uniformly are not really collecting the same kind of data that we do in Tennessee and a few other states like Louisiana on teacher effectiveness in the K-12 classroom. Because when you have that data, then there's so much you can do with it, including this really rich reporting to teacher prep. But I wish there were more states that were able to share some of that data back.
Great. Okay, Spencer, thank you. Good job.
back over to our DOE colleagues.
Amy Wooten and I were texting. We may make a few kind of mid-course changes here just to get us back on track. I think one thing for the board members to be thinking about as we transition is that I do think some amount of this information we'll want to recap for the full board in April at the workshop. So kind of be thinking about what you think your fellow board members would want to hear from what we've shared today. And one of those things that we might hold is sort of more detail on the partnership work. But Amy, we'll just see how our timing plays out as you go. I definitely want to get to instructional leader because I think that'll help for the conversation in April.
Okay.
Am I on? Yes. All right. Here's just a kind of a brief agenda of everything I'd like to talk through related to annual reports. We'll talk a little bit about the overview to the changes that we made this year. We'll revisit the purpose and goals of the insights tool and the performance report. That's a distinction we're making this year that we didn't have last year. We'll talk about how the metrics and expectations were developed. We'll actually go through the metrics and expectations on the annual reports. And then, as Spencer mentioned, we had great alignment between data collection processes for both the report card and annual reports, but I'll highlight a few key distinctions that may kind of surface some of the differences you might see in outcomes across the two reports. We'll actually go through the EPP results by domain and overall, and then I'll spend a little bit of time demoing what folks are seeing in the field on their screens when they look at the annual reports. So again, the Insights tool, this year we really looked to providers for feedback, and a lot of the feedback we got was related to data visualization, so we changed some of the way that it looks. A huge thorn in folks' side last year was that they had to download a separate piece of software to view the annual reports. They had to adjust their screen resolution. All these technological things were hurdles. So we solved that problem. The reports are now accessible through the TN Atlas system, and each individual person has their own login to that system, and they can only see their EPP's annual reports. And then we had that third view on the report last year that allowed providers to set metrics alongside each other and look at potential relationships between them. We've removed that this year, and we're seeking feedback on just a tool that might be better for providers to better understand trends or relationships between metrics. And then obviously the performance report is brand new. So this is a new accountability report focused on specific metrics that have been pulled out. And we've set minimum expectations for performance on each metric, domain, and at the overall level. So slightly different approach this year now that we've got these accountability levers in place. So I won't spend too much time on this, but the Insights tool, again, is that tool that allows the EPP user to dig into their data at a very granular level. And that tool is really intended to give EPPs the data they need to think about continuous improvement. Where are they doing well? Where are they struggling? And then the performance report is really to provide EPPs, the state, and review teams, as it's part of the review process, with data that can be used to inform the decision to conduct an interim review. Amy mentioned this earlier. We're not just looking at a 7-year cycle where we don't check in with providers throughout that interim period. We're actually looking at data. And if a provider falls below expectations on the performance report for 2 consecutive years, they'd have to engage in an interim review process. It will also inform approval recommendations during the comprehensive review. So when we do have 7 years of annual reports, those results will inform the recommendations made during that comprehensive review.
Michael, I want to jump in here and just make a point that I think is important. You mentioned earlier about one of the things that's powerful about the report card is that it may spur some competition. And I think that's a difference between what the report card is designed to do and what the annual report is designed to do. And so as we walk through this, you'll note that we have thresholds that set a specific expectation to say, in order to be meeting our expectations as an educator preparation provider in Tennessee, you have to meet this bar. And so that's different because theoretically, every provider could meet the bar, or every provider could perform below the bar. And so that is one important functional distinction between the report card and the annual report.
Great point. Like more standards-based sort of accountability
Right.
versus,
Right.
comparable
Correct.
relative accountability on the
That's
report
right.
card.
Yeah, and both I think are valuable. and serve
And I
different
think it's important
purposes.
that the data sort of populating both reports is similar and,
Correct.
you know, the integrity is there for both data. So it's not sending people in different directions, but they're
No,
different
and
uses.
and I think that's something we've questioned is, you know, if we do see differences, do we understand why and do they make sense?
Yep.
And I think we've got some good answers to that.
Yeah, right. So the process of developing metrics and expectations has been a multi-year process at this point. We engaged the EPWG in really figuring out what are the metrics that are appropriate for accountability within the 5 domains that we have. And then the group looked at 2 years of data, looked at the distributions across EPPs, and really dug in and said, where should this minimum threshold be set for each metric? And then ultimately, we took those recommendations and made final decisions for those thresholds. And then we had to think about within a domain, how do we tree up the metrics within that domain to say that a provider has met expectations within a domain? And then how do we tree up across domains to say a provider has met expectations overall? So I'm not going to go over this, and you probably can't see it very well anyway, but we'll make sure you have it. You know, again, we use the same data source. We have the same foundational expectation for quality of data, and I think we did a much better job this year than we have in the past. But there are some key distinctions across the reports, just in some of the items that we decided to report for accountability purposes on the performance report that may not be included on the report card, some nuances as to how we calculate various metrics. And one thing I think is really important to note, though, is that we do see significant consistency across outcomes where providers that are performing really well on the report card are meeting expectations on the annual reports, and some of the providers that are struggling on the report card do not meet expectations on the annual report. So that's a very good thing.
Alignment.
Yeah. I will go through the expectations, and I'll spend a little bit of time on these just so everybody's familiar with the thresholds that we did set. So in domain 1, candidate recruitment and selection, EPPs must, if they're rated on 6 metrics, all 6 metrics, they must meet 4 of the metrics. We have business rules that say if you're not reported on one metric because of suppression rules, exactly what has to happen there. But for providers that have all 6 metrics, they cover everything from that admissions assessment. So we look at ACT, SAT, and those Praxis core exams that were referenced a moment ago. So the percentage of undergraduate candidates meeting one of those admissions requirements. The expectation is that 95% of undergraduate candidates meet that requirement. The next 2 are related to GPA. Percentage of candidates meeting the minimum undergraduate GPA expectation. So the expectation there is at 95%, meet the 2.75 or higher. And then this average undergraduate GPA expectation actually comes directly from CAPE. The expectation is that the cohort undergraduate GPA is at or above 3.0. So that is an expectation that carries over to our reports. The next 3 are related to kind of candidate profile. So the first one is related to candidates from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group, the percentage of completers who are male, and then the last one is the percentage of completers who receive high needs endorsement. And for each of these, we kind of have a 2-pronged approach to how providers could meet expectations. So for race and ethnicity, the expectation is that either we're seeing that they're trending positively, so we're seeing growth in this area, or they're at a threshold of 22% of completers coming from that. And that was a percentage that we developed when we looked over time at the goals that we expected for the state and where we wanted EPPs to be. We saw that we would have to create an initial expectation, but that would likely grow over time. So that's not always going to be a 22%. Same thing is true for the percentage of completers who are male. And then with high needs endorsement, it's either growth over time or that they fall in at least the 75th percentile in terms of production of completers with high needs endorsement.
Okay.
Any questions on domain 1?
I went through that pretty quickly, but I know there was a lot of time and effort spent and conversations had about where these thresholds should be set, because it really is, this will be a big deal. I mean, this will be what informs sort of whether someone's making the grade or not and what actions we take. So do you all, I mean, I guess to throw that back to you all, I mean, based on the extensive conversations, do you all feel good about these thresholds? And
Yeah. Yeah.
Or EPPs.
We think that they, particularly, so the first three of these, for example, are tightly aligned, well, the first two are tightly aligned with our policy. And so the question is, are you meeting the expectation that our policy sets? And then, but, in terms of the percentage related to that, like the 95%, our providers and those folks on the Ed Prep Working Group really pushed on this. They want to have high expectations for this. And so I think that we talked about different numbers. We brought to them, if we did different things, what would happen in terms of using those 2 years of data to say, we didn't give them names of EPPs, but we would say this would mean that, a quarter of EPPs would not meet this threshold set at this place. But they were more committed to what it should be than worried about, how many
get there.
providers wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we feel strongly that these are good expectations for.
Look like good numbers. I guess I'm surprised that they're as rigorous as they are, and I hope that we can meet those.
I think it's good too because not everybody, and you'll see this, but not everybody's meeting everything because then it wouldn't be valuable, and it
Right.
also gives folks a real clear target to work toward.
Domain 2, we had a whole lot of discussion about this. Spencer actually addressed this earlier. The group found that it was maybe not appropriate to use initial employment on an accountability report because of a lot of the noise that's there related to folks going to one of the 8 states that we border, or going to graduate school, or teaching in a private school. But they did think it was important to note that for providers that are seeing a percentage of their folks employed in Tennessee, how many of those actually stay in Tennessee? And this is an area where we calculate it a little differently, but we look at the 3-year period and say, what percentage of your completers taught for at least 2 years? And the expectation there that was set was that 85% of the individuals who are employed in any single year are then employed in another year.
Again, this was driven by us looking at the data and trying to say, is there a threshold at which, when it's below that, we begin to say, this could
Doesn't
be
feel
really
right.
something that's underlying it. So we don't have to know every reason, but we know that there's enough turnover that it's a place where we're not ready to say you're meeting our expectation.
And we've gotten some feedback that it's unfortunate that we have one metric in this domain. And we've had a few conversations about that and have considered that when we do finalize metrics related to primary partner satisfaction, that this could maybe be paired with that as kind of some kind of an indicator as to how satisfied districts are with the individuals that are coming from an EPP. Are they continuing to employ them? Are they satisfied generally with how well prepared they were?
And are candidates satisfied enough with their preparation that they're staying in this
Right.
field?
Right.
So if Columbia did not have 85% stay in New York, would we look at them as not so good?
So the answer to that question right now is yes. And the way that we did that was by looking across all of our provider data in the past and saying, when does it, we looked for, and Michael, jump in here if you want to, but we looked for, drops in the data that suggested that this is different than what we see the vast majority of our other providers achieving. We had lots of conversations. This is not an easy metric. Placement and retention are not perfect measures. And we can look in a few minutes because Michael will show by domain who met and didn't meet. And then have a conversation about that as well.
I have a question and clarification. On the report card, when we look at the first year placement rate and retention, we're looking at only folks who get their initial Tennessee license. So if somebody says, I know I'm moving to North Carolina, I'm not messing with my Tennessee license, I'm just getting my North Carolina one, they don't count against a program. Is that the same here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd also add that it's a metric, granted it's a domain, in a system. So we'll get to a slide in a moment that shows that providers could fall behind on one domain. So if Columbia was just struggling specifically with this issue, it wouldn't mean that they would be flagged. But it would be something they'd need to consider.
That's one of the other reasons that we are eager to put some other indicators in this domain.
Yeah. Candidate assessment. This is an area where we had three different areas of focus for metrics: pedagogical assessment, literacy assessment, and specialty area assessment. And what we do is we aggregate the assessments within each category to come up with an expectation of 90% across the board. So the group felt, also to clarify, that's within 2 attempts. The group thought that it was important not to just consider the first attempt, because we've heard from a number of people that candidates may often just kind of test out an exam and try it and see if it feels right to them in a specific content area. So if we look at 2 administrations, then we're considering a better sample. We tried to look at 3, and I think the team felt that that was too many, but 2 felt appropriate.
This is EdTPA that we're talking about at this point in terms of
Not
our
at this,
pedagogical?
not yet. The pedagogical assessment is the PLT. However, when we shift to EdTPA for all providers, we would look at something
Starting
like
next year, this would
average,
be EdTPA.
right, average EdTPA score. Questions? And again, providers would have to meet 2 of the 3 expectations there to meet that domain. And the last domain is completer effectiveness and impact. Again, they'd have to meet 2 out of 3, or they'd have to meet the metric on TVOS. So we have 3 metrics here, one related to overall level of effectiveness, or LOE, one specifically on TVOS, and another one on observation. And this was, I think, the toughest one for the group to work through and set some thresholds. Because we do see a fairly wide variety of performance in this area, but around level of effectiveness, the expectation set was that 85% of LOE ratings are 3 or higher.
That's your overall evaluation score, so all the components combined.
Right. And that's actually something I don't think is on the report card, but that we've got on our performance report. TVOS, they looked at that a little differently and looked at the distribution across the state and the average performance, and believed that the expectation here should be that they either meet or exceed the state average. That was one where I think across the state you see varying performance, and you wouldn't want to set a bar that's too low either, but if you set it right at the state average, then we're really being clear that we expect providers to meet this metric to be at or above the state average.
So I'm going to jump in here and just again point out that this is where it's a standards based, and the expectation is that a provider is training someone who can be effective in the classroom, and a level 3 is considered an effective
Expectations.
educator. And so that's at expectations, and that's why we think it is important. And again, a differentiating component with the report card, where they are focused on, are you producing also large numbers of 4s and 5s? I think we might in the future think about ways to provide distinctions on the annual report, but we just haven't there. We're not there yet, but again, just wanted to point that out.
Is this after 3 years of teaching?
No.
No, this is every TVOS rating that an individual gets.
Year 1?
Year 1, year 2, year 3.
Well, no, I take that back. This is if they have a multi-year score. So if they've taught for 3 years and they have a multi-year score,
But all their years of teaching are included,
that's
including their
correct.
first
Yeah,
year.
right. Percentage observation ratings at or above 3, the expectation there, and we do see that observation ratings are a little higher. 90% of observation ratings would need to be a 3 or higher.
And again, like the report card, I think that what we will do is look at these expectations over time and ask every year or so whether they need to be adjusted to, how does our current data,
And Michael, before you go on to how this all comes together, will you mention just briefly, and forgive me if I missed it and you already said it, but domain 4, kind of where we are with that?
Yes. So domain 4 is candidate, partner, and employer satisfaction. And we have draft surveys. We've actually piloted some of those surveys through different instruments in the department. But where we are with that is that we want to, number one, build in probably a process through TN Atlas to be able to deliver some of those surveys, and 2, somehow come to an agreement on an indices or some kind of indicator that we can point to that says that primary partners are satisfied. Right now we have a slate of questions that doesn't easily translate into accountability. So we need to spend some time really thinking about how can we aggregate some of that data to be able to identify a partnership as strong or not.
Another thing that our providers have pointed out that is a true or real concern is it also depends on who at a district takes that survey, and if that could, the responses could vary by that, who ends up responding. And so we want to try to put some parameters around that. So perhaps the ed prep provider gets to designate some folks that they would like it to go to. But we also always would send it to the director of schools, for example, to make sure that that person got to choose if there was anybody else they wanted to respond to it.
Similarly, for the candidate survey, the
that, yeah.
timing of that
Yes.
is a question that
important.
I hear a
Ti-
lot.
That's
timing
right.
is a question, and I think what we've seen is that more effective novice teachers are more critical of their preparation program. So you don't want to get data back that suggests that the provider is ineffective from teachers that are effective. They're giving critical feedback, but we may not want to ding providers that are getting that feedback from highly effective teachers. So.
Or we may want to just make sure we understand
Right.
what it is that we're.
So based on where you are with the pilot, is that something you expect would fold into the next year's annual reports, or what's sort of our expected timeline? I don't want to hold you too hard, but just generally, how are you feeling in terms of the development?
I think if I'm being really just straight, I think that getting it into next year's report card is a reach. I think that we can, because we still need to pilot pushing it through TN Atlas. It'll be a brand new, so like I'm thinking about the candidate survey explicitly. We won't have ever, what we've been using is the existing Educator survey, and we just have a module of questions. When we push it out as its own survey, it'll be a much broader survey, but that means it'll be the very first time we've used it. So we wouldn't know how to benchmark results. So I think we'll need
The
to
first year
report some
of full
this
data, yeah, to report, but not necessarily score.
Yeah.
Is that what you're imagining?
That's what I'm hoping for. And in terms of the partner survey, I think we've got to answer some of these questions. And we are, still, we're elevating our expectations related to partnerships districts and providers have, but getting some of this information, it sounds like it's an easy thing, but, to try to get them to identify who in the district and agree on that and who's even a primary partner and all of those kinds of, there are a lot of
At
logistics
that, I mean, there's a lot, I think
behind that.
it'll be work that's worth getting through though, because I do think, in terms of what people will respond to, just like we see student surveys really driving conversations with teachers because it's so close to the source, this will be good information once we kind of work through some of that, because there are, a lot of questions.
I think everybody wants it to happen. Well, everybody, yeah. I think we all want it to happen. It's just a matter of, sometimes it's manpower.
Yep.
And do we have, we're trying to do a lot of different things. And so.
No, I totally understand that. I would really just wanted to temper expectations and sort of understand too the complexity of what we're trying to figure out, but also the value that it'll lend once we have it.
Yeah. So hopefully data in the coming year. That would be
Awesome.
So overall, again, this was a discussion had with the EPWG. EPPs must meet 3 out of the 4 rated domains, and EPPs must meet domain 5. And that was, from the start, we said that this is a shift to an accountability system that focuses on outcomes. So the expectation is that you meet, that domain 5 that focuses on evaluation and student growth.
Is that true for CAPE as well in terms of how they determine who's meeting expectations?
Not quite.
What does theirs look like? If you don't know, that's okay. I'm curious because, like we were saying earlier, my sense has been that we have a
It's
higher
a
bar.
standard. There is a standard that is entirely focused on data.
not outcome. All of it.
Two
It's-
of the indicators are
Right.
outcome, but it's not. I don't think that it's an axe approach.
I think part of the reason I'm hesitating is CAPE has a hard time because they deal with so many different states who have so many different things that this is where, again, we have the benefit of being able to be very standardized in our approach to that, where they don't, because a lot of states don't have this data. And so they may not meet the expectation, and it's a little, yeah.
But we can
But we are saying in our state,
yeah.
and this has been, we're working with CAPE to figure out how we're gonna do this, but in our state, this is the expectation for standard 4.
If you're going through CAPE accreditation.
Correct.
We are saying it for our recommendation to the board, we'll be able to do that Cape owns when
Their
they make a
recommendation, right.
recommendation.
But even if,
Yeah.
I guess what I'm just trying to clarify, even if you're a school that's going through the CAPE accreditation process, we would also make a recommendation based on this
Absolutely.
framework.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah, this whole system doesn't just apply to the state managed review providers.
Okay?
So outcomes. And I'll go through this briefly, and then we'll advance to a slide that talks about overall. But within Domain 1, candidate recruitment and selection, 28 of the 36 EPPs rated on this domain met expectations. And the EPPs that did not meet expectations are listed there: Austin P, Carson Newman, Christian Brothers, Lincoln Memorial, Martin Methodist, South, Trevecca, and UT Chattanooga. Domain 2, employment and retention, so just that retention metric, 29 of the 33 EPPs rated on this domain met expectations. Bryan, Maryville, TNTP Nashville, and Vanderbilt did not. Domain 3, candidate assessment, 33 of the 37 EPPs rated on this domain met expectations. Bethel, Freed-Hardeman, Lemoyne-Owen, and Memphis College of Art did not. And then lastly, Domain 5, completer effectiveness and impact, 30 of the 36 of EPPs rated met expectations. Bethel, Bryan, Martin Methodist, Memphis College of Art, South, and Welch did not. And overall, those same 6 providers did not meet expectations, mostly because they didn't meet expectations on Domain 5. However, I think a handful of these providers, as you noticed on the last slide, also didn't meet expectations in at least one other domain. Okay, we're gonna shift, and I will, if we have time, I can show you.
While Michael's doing this, do you have any questions about that?
So if you were one of those on that last slide, what would be going through your head right now?
Well, hopefully what they're doing is digging into their insights tool to really analyze what is driving the results that they see on their performance report, and asking themselves questions about how can we make any shifts to, improve those results. We're hoping that's what's happening. Another thing we want to do is continue to reach out to these providers and make sure that they have opportunities to have conversations with us so that we can support their exploration of this data for them, and to make sure they're clear that if they continue to not meet expectations next year, they will move into a formal interim review process with us where they have to have an explicit plan for how they're going to improve their
We normally follow any conversations we have that are of that nature in writing.
You mean notifying them in writing about the fact that they're on
If
this
we have a
CUSP list?
conversation, just sort of like she had with me, would there be something just for the record that would be, so there's not any, well, we didn't know that.
Well, that gets, yeah, I mean, we have notified them that they didn't meet expectations. Was that in writing? How were programs notified that they were on this list?
So we've sent emails to every school to alert them to the fact, and Michael's going to show you the annual report in a moment, and we've said to every dean that's responsible for an EPP, your annual report is ready. Here's how you access it, and we've given them information about what it means. We also hosted a webinar that anybody could attend. We recorded it. We're going to post it later for people to watch.
So we fully documented.
They
all
have it in
this.
writing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I think that's a good point, Mike.
I think it's a great point, but I think that we also will want to follow up with these 6 providers
Yeah.
explicitly. We haven't done that yet, but I think we will.
Mhm.
We are in a little bit of a review window right this moment with our providers, where we released it and we said we give you until the 20th of this month to let us know if you see any errors or anything that you think is wrong. And so they will be fully finalized at that point, and then we will, have these conversations.
Okay, Mike?
Okay. So what you're seeing here is the TN Atlas system. Folks at Cumberland have been kind enough to let us use their annual reports as an example, just to share with you what they're able to see. So there's a tab here for annual reports. download required, but sometimes it takes a moment to load.
A lot of data behind it.
Right. And the kind of what we call the splash page or the landing page gives a clear definition of the difference between the two reports, which we went over just a moment ago. And then we're working on resources such as a technical guide, maybe even some of these key distinctions between the performance report and the report card, just so folks are clear in their head the differences. But I'll briefly show you the Insights tool. It looks fairly similar to what we produced last year with some adjustments, again, to data visualization. But EPPs can really dig into their data here. So they can see either 3-year values, single-year values. Again, the bubble represents the EPP up here, and the line represents the state average. They can switch domains, so if we look at effectiveness and impact, they can see everything, again, down to the indicator level on the team rubric. So for the individuals who have completed their preparation program, how are they doing on that observation rubric? And then they can view metric details by endorsement area, cluster, program type, clinical type, and now that actually just appears below the EPP value. So this, again, is the tool that they would use to really dig into their data, especially after they've looked at the report card and the performance report and want to better understand what's driving the results.
If we could get this in the hands of chancellors and presidents, the light's gonna come on
That's exactly what we've been doing in
Or,
this room with these meetings.
a whole lot of other majors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we got this department, why aren't we doing it with that department?
We've
I've-
seen it happening.
Yeah, and a couple presidents have made that comment. I mean, they have so much more data on their education prep programs than they have on any of their other programs. Michael, will you go back and do it by endorsement area? Because I think that's
Sure.
one of the ahas in some of these meetings where we've been having sort of anecdotal conversations about how programs feel about various of their sort of areas of endorsement, like elementary education, and feeling like, things look really good or not. But then you can verify that by looking to see how do our elementary education
had
graduates do.
We had an interesting conversation with a specific provider about, and we were able to answer that question on the spot about how they were doing, and you could see it sparked a conversation between the university leadership
Right.
and the School of Education.
Part of it is still training them to use this tool. I mean, there's so much
Yes.
information you can access. In that case, they hadn't seen that data, even though they had the tool, they hadn't looked at it.
I think that's
that
another
way.
big step for us is, this data isn't, if it's not actionable, it's not useful. And so one of the big pieces of work for us is to think about how to develop those resources and tools that help them use this better.
I think naturally, too, now that we have an accountability tool and they have to log into the system to get to that accountability tool, they should then start to gravitate towards answering some of the questions they may have through this Insights tool. So, Sarah, as an example, here are the 3 domains on the team rubric, and here's how their completers are doing by endorsement area within these domains. And you can
So
see
cool.
differentiation, right? You can see that they're not consistent across the board.
I mean, just as I'm scanning it, I'm looking, their history
History,
program is having some struggles across the board. And so that would be an immediate place where we go back and want to have a conversation about what's going on there.
This is amazing.
Is there anything that fosters, I guess, sharing of best practices between EPPs?
So I think, that's the part of the challenge is that there's not been a good way to know what is a best practice because there hasn't been real insight into which programs and providers are really succeeding, which is what the report cards and the annual reports are hoping to do. And the networks that we've talked about, the literacy networks, the partnership networks, things like that are where we hope that sharing is going to begin to happen.
I know a lot of the best practices are with individual teachers. Like Penny Watcher,
Ferguson.
people ask her all the time, but I suspect there's others in East Tennessee that, it's
Wondering if
individual
there's
teachers.
something that Cumberland is doing that Lemoyne could learn from,
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And
And-
how do you
foster that.
foster that kind of
I think it's
sharing.
the right question to be asking.
I think even in the face of accountability, we're seeing some of that happening. We're seeing providers start to have these conversations, and they're not nearly as territorial as you might expect, given that we're putting them up against each other, quite frankly, data-wise.
And as I mentioned, that was one of the things I was most excited about seeing at the Literacy Network was the various providers talking to each other. We encouraged them to share their proposals with each other. We said, this isn't a test, like in the sense of you can't work together. So please do work together and come up with the best program that you can come up with in collaboration. And we saw a lot of those connections being
And
made.
including sharing curriculum.
Yes, we actually had
Yeah.
we've had conversations about developing coursework that looks similar across providers. And we had a specific focus on our first literacy network meeting. Second literacy network meeting, no, first, on curricular resources and how critical they are in the K-12 classroom, and how Tennessee educator preparation providers need to be using the curricular resources that folks will be seeing when they get to the classrooms. They're taking that teaching literacy and Tennessee document, not only just the one, but they're including that in their course packs. It's really exciting to see the changes they're making. But I want to talk about
Yeah.
performance reports.
So
Before we run
performance
out of time.
reports, another, we could sit here all day. We could stay here till the afternoon if you. Performance reports also accessible through TN Atlas.
It should be crystal clear when they come to this page where they stand.
So overall, expectations are here, whether the provider has met those expectations we just spoke about. And then they can select a domain, an individual domain, and see how well they're doing. Obviously, we don't have metrics for domain 4 yet. We discussed that. And then if you hover over this, it gives those business rules. So just what does a provider have to do to meet expectations overall? You can view details within a domain.
Should mention too, we have the same vendor that does the annual reports, that does the report cards. So you'll see some design similarities.
No.
Oh, we don't anymore?
No, we worked with, this is a state vendor. We
Oh,
worked
I'm
with,
so
actually.
impressed.
It
Tim,
didn't cost us anything.
wow. Well, we should talk about
We
that.
should talk about that.
We did have the same vendor, and it still looks the same. So that's good.
So here's an example of a domain details page. They can hover over the domain and again see the expectations for that domain. And then within each metric, they can hover over the symbol to, there we go, to get a little more detail. The expectation, where they stand as far as their specific data for the 3-year period. But it's fairly straightforward. We wanted to create an accountability tool that was simple, that was very clear. A provider could go in here and just very easily see where they're falling down, where they're not meeting expectations, and then go back to that insights tool and start to investigate further. Any questions?
Like it.
Looks good.
Looks great.
I'm going to throw this out in the interest of time.
Okay.
Should we jump to leader prep, or do you all want to do a quick run through on either the partnership or the clinical mentoring? We've got about just over 15 minutes.
Clinical mentoring, while Michael is, yeah, let's talk about that for like 2 or 3 minutes. So
Can I time you?
yes, you can. I'm going to go fast. So we think that there's real potential in really thinking about how we set expectations for those clinical teachers that are working with our candidates. And so this spring, we have engaged with 2 providers, Freed Hardeman and Carson Newman, to do a pilot with them. We did a 2-day training with their clinical mentors. We focused on questioning, and we focused on how they give feedback to candidates. And the feedback we got from them was, give more. We love this. We need this. We want this, and do more with us. And so we're going to be working with them over the course of this semester to see what kind of feedback and how their conversations with candidates might look different than mentors who don't have that training and their conversations with candidates. There's some anecdotal evidence that suggests that conversations are very general, vague, personal, but not instructionally focused. And we're hoping to be able to make a shift on that, which we think will have a significant impact. Then we'll learn from that training this spring, and next fall we're going to do a much larger pilot that's actual a randomized controlled research study with Matt Ronfelt to really examine this, with the hopes that we can determine what the state should do. We're thinking about things like setting competencies for what should a clinical mentor know and be able to do that's different from just providing good instruction. Thinking about how do we deliver training if this is something that we want to do. Is this something the state can do? Do we want to train university supervisors to be able to do this? What might that look like? So I just wanted you to know that we're doing that work because I think we're very excited about it. In tandem with it, we're thinking about all these other things related to incentives and saying, what does it, Matt Ronfeld's team has just done a landscape study. They've called a whole bunch of our providers and had interviews with them to say, what does your clinical experience look like? And thinking about what do clinical educators want and need in this role. They are teacher leaders in this role, and we would love to see them treated that way.
Do you think this is huge? I mean, just as my own experience as an example, I mean, you learn more in your student teaching than you do in all the courses you take at the university. I mean, that's where it comes together. So
Y'all are dealing with the disincentive of worrying about your end of course exam.
I mean, we're thinking about all of it, right? You know, so.
Gotcha.
Asset helping prepare for this.
and that kind of
We'd
thing.
love to see that happen that way, yeah. So we've got slides in here on partnerships, but we're gonna just hold, we're gonna skip over that. You've heard us talk about Partnership Network before, but we're very happy with where that's going and where Literacy Network has gone. But I've talked about that a bunch today already.
I can actually go, I think, fairly quickly through some of these initial slides because we presented them at the last workshop as well. So we'll provide some information on the working group that came up with some of the recommendations. I'll talk a little bit more about the annual reports that we're seeking to develop for leader prep programs, and then we'll talk about next steps. So again, the composition of the work group included 7 members, 4 EPPs, 2 districts, also some department staff that are experts in this area. We had 2 meetings, July and August of last summer, and then virtual follow-up conversations. And they really looked at that learning-centered leadership policy and the educator preparation policy through the lens of what are the strong aspects of the existing educator preparation policy that leader prep could really kind of latch onto. And how can we integrate the processes as well? So they developed reporting expectations for instructional leader preparation programs, so starting to shift to think about, again, outcomes, annual reports. How do the metrics look different? How would we go about reporting performance for instructional leader programs? And then I kind of already noted that last bullet. So the metrics look a little different, but you'll see some similarities across what is on the teacher prep annual reports and what would be on an annual report for leader prep. But it includes in recruitment and selection, the percentage of candidates coming from an underrepresented racial and or ethnic group. Performance on the team professionalism rubric. So for educators who are coming directly from Tennessee in a teaching position, there's that professionalism rubric that has some indicators on it that could potentially point to leadership potential. There was a statement in the Learning Center leadership policy that said that providers are required to select candidates who have the potential for leadership. Well, we got a lot of feedback that what does that even mean? How do you measure that? And so the group felt that this was an area that, or this was a rubric that could be used to serve that purpose.
By the way, there are corporations that put people through some assessments to determine if they have
True.
leadership.
I think at least one provider uses the Gallup survey for, I think, in some part, that purpose. Domain 2, employment and retention, would have metrics related to the percentage of completers employed in a qualifying leadership position within a certain period of time, And then of those employed, how many stay in a qualifying leadership position, which would basically be any position that requires the license. Domain 3 would focus on satisfaction data. So I can imagine we would incorporate questions in those surveys we discussed just a moment ago specific to folks who have left a leader prep program and are now employed as assistant principals or principals. And then you'll see an obvious shift to outcomes. With Domain 4, program completion rates. Are the folks that they're selecting and bringing into their program finishing the program? Are they passing the school leader licensure assessment? And then impact metrics would include everything from overall evaluation, observation ratings, school-wide growth ratings for a segment of the population, growth on ACT for principals in secondary settings, results from the Tennessee Educator survey, which I think has been out for quite a few years, and there's a section on school climate and leadership. And then retention of effective teachers. And I think we got some feedback also that attrition of low-performing teachers or growth of low-performing teachers might be another area that would be worth focusing on. But are the effective teachers staying in that school?
How do we, when we see growth in ACT, how do we know it is the growth that ought to happen? We could have growth like that, and we could have growth like that, and we could, and depending on the school, I'm sure, but there ought to be an expectation. Did you hit the expectation in that growth?
Degree of growth.
We'll go through a process much like we did with annual reports over time to look at the data and use a group of folks to help us make those specific expectations of when we have a metric that's growth. It's kind of the way that we did with candidate diversity on the teacher preparation report card. We did a lot of examination of data and collectively set a growth expectation based on understanding the data. So
Is the data, are we looking at data historically?
We're certainly going to try.
So if we've had historically superficially low growth, does that not mean that we can look at other data and say, but actually we've been underperforming, we ought to hit a higher level?
well, I think that there's an interesting question there that's perhaps even broader than leader preparation. And I think that would be the question, because the purpose of this is saying, is our leader preparation program doing what it should? If our goal is to increase growth on ACT, I think there's an
Or anything?
I hear what you're saying. I think that if we feel like the historical data is not representative of where we want to be, you want to make sure that you build in an expectation a scaffold increase over time. If we just bluntly, elevate it dramatically, then what you'll see is just nobody will meet the expectation at all.
Well, so I don't want to get into that, but one of the problems with T-BOS is that we can have incremental growth every year, and that child, when they leave high school, is not ready to go do something. So if we're really, the goal is kids being prepared to walk into post-high school training or something, and then you redo your trajectory to see how close are we getting to that.
I think we can take all of those points into consideration. I think our first goal is to get some data for everybody to even look at before
Even some of the metrics you were sharing before me, there was it seemed like expectation for progress over time on like I'm thinking about the Domain 1 metrics. But I think one of the questions I had and didn't ask them was how often are we going to look at sort of our thresholds and potentially readjust. And I think that's part of it too, is how do we change our expectations over time in terms of what progress is adequate to get to standard. But yeah.
And again, changing them because it's the right thing to do for the goals that we've set, not because we're looking at how many providers are meeting or not meeting
Right.
expectations.
Yeah.
So this is our timeline. Right now, we're gathering stakeholder feedback. We had a breakout session at TACTI on this topic. We're conducting analyses on existing data. We have collected some leader prep data through the report card process, but I think it's limited, quite frankly. Jason Grissom at Vanderbilt has done a lot of work in this area, and he's used a different data source, so I'd like to chat with him and see kind of how that process worked. But I think we're going to find that there are some gaps in the data that we have available to us at this point in time, so we may need to consider some other data collection process. Summer and fall, as Amy mentioned, we'd really dig into these metrics and better define exactly how they're calculated, what the thresholds should be, looking at the historical data we do have. And that would probably take place with a working group, either part of the EPWG or a separate small group that would really look at that data. And then ultimately, we want to release initial annual reports next year, though I think through this process, we'll determine exactly which metrics we have the data to be able to report and what that would look like next year. But that's our goal.
In a similar vein, and we're having conversations across our offices about sort of what is the corollary to the teacher prep report card look like for leader prep, and again, acknowledging that we're not probably in a place where we can make value judgments yet with the data, but when and how can we begin to release some of this leader prep data as an informational in terms
Right.
of helping to understand leader prep programs across the state and building towards a report card that would look like the teacher or something like the teacher prep report card over time.
And I think we've done that in lots of areas of releasing data in the state, not just with preparation, but in other areas where we release the data first, let folks like examine their data and think about their data before we're setting, public thresholds related to it.
So that these guys know too, I mean, we'll be hearing from you all in April with a final reading on these, what parts of the policy.
Yeah, we actually have one more slide
Oh,
that goes
sorry.
into,
Didn't mean
no,
to
that's
jump to the
okay,
punch.
but it would be second reading on annual reports metrics, and then it would be first reading on these more qualitative items. So the group didn't just look at metrics. They looked in each section of the Learning Centered Leadership Policy and the Ed Prep policy and really started to, again, think about integrating those policies. So generally speaking, the idea was that the whole review process that is outlined in the educator preparation policy should also apply to leader preparation programs instead of having this separate review process. So right now we have it set up that all leader prep programs were recommended for full approval, I believe in either 2014 or 2015, which then puts them all again in a review process in 2021 or 22, I believe. So this would then integrate leader prep programs into the broader educator preparation review process, also then folding in the requirements for annual reporting, interim reviews, focus reviews, and then these are some other areas that either had specific expectations related to leader prep or we just wanted to call out as things that the group found to be especially important, partnerships being a really huge one there. So program eligibility. In the educator preparation policy, there is outlined a process for out-of-state providers to apply to become approved providers in Tennessee. It's a rigorous process, and to the best of my knowledge, we don't have any providers that have submitted an application for that. But at this time, the group felt that it was not appropriate to have out-of-state providers apply to become a provider specifically for instructional leader preparation. That's not to say that they can't get an individual can't get a license if they complete an out-of-state preparation program, because they can, but just that we would not review and approve an out-of-state provider for the purpose of preparing instructional leaders.
I would say 40.
No, there are,
Subset.
it's a subset.
There's nobody who runs leader prep that doesn't have an
Correct.
approved EPP.
Yeah. There could be, but there's currently
not.
How large is that subset roughly?
It's 19 individual providers, some of which have 2 different tracks or programs within. And then I think we have 38 approved EPPs. Procedures for approval. The group wanted to make it very clear that
You've got 1 minute.
Oh, great. A requirement that at least one individual on the review team be well-versed in the standards and expectations for leader prep. Candidate admission, they wanted to reduce the experience requirement for admission from 3 years to 1 year. There would still be a requirement for 3 years for issuance of a license, but the group felt that it was fairly too restrictive, and that there are some folks out there who have 1 or 2 years of high-quality teaching experience, and that they should not be prohibited from being admitted to a prep program. Partnerships, ensure that all the aspects of primary partnerships apply to the preparation of instructional leaders. And then standards, separately, you'll receive a recommendation for updating the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards to better align with the department's strategic plan and the PSEL standards, Professional Standards for Educational Leadership, that were passed in 2015.
Okay, I believe you did it in about 1
Did
minute.
I? Did I? Good.
Well done, Michael.
Okay, Amy?
I'm sorry, we will get copies of all the presentations.
Really appreciate all of your time today. Our department colleagues for putting together so much wonderful information to share with you guys, as well as your time this morning. I think you've been given a pretty good preview of what you'll be seeing at the next 1 to 2 board meetings regarding educator and leader preparation and licensure, so you'll know what's coming up. And as Sarah said, be thinking about what you'd want the whole board to hear at the April or July workshops, and feel free to shoot me an email, any kind of brainwaves you have about what you want the rest of your colleagues to see. Is there any final closeout?
I think so. I'm sure there'll be some follow-up conversations one-on-one if you have additional thoughts on any of this, but I just echo your thanks to Michael and Amy in particular, and Candace when she was here. But any final thoughts before we?
Yes, I have a final thought. Will Fielding come back to the next meeting and chair?
Yes.
Do we know when our next meeting is?
I would.
19th and,
No,
oh, the
no,
subcommittee.
no, no,
I would
Oh,
say
sorry, you
let's-
meant subcommittee.
so-
Let's.
Oh, I haven't nailed them down on that. I don't know.
Potentially after the April meeting, let's revisit it and see what we feel like needs to be done next and what the appropriate time would be there, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Great.
Good, good meeting. Certainly appreciate all the presentations. Good work. I, continue to be amazed at how much is going on. I've been a little bit concerned that we weren't making progress, but I think we are making good progress. I do encourage you to continue with the leader preparation thing, because, I said earlier that the teacher preparation is one of the major issues we've got, but I think it's closely followed by leader preparation. In fact, the fact we haven't done as much there perhaps gets a higher priority on the list. So I think very important work. Okay. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you
Good
all.
job.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Great work.
That was good. We got through nearly everything we wanted to. I did. That's fine. Do you want to go with me into the upgrade? Why don't you call me?
I'm afraid
Okay.
I don't want to get stuck in
Right.
a car with all these
Yeah.
nervous like crazy.
Well, yeah, why don't you call me? I'll probably go grab something. Just call me in like 30 minutes once you're on the road.
Okay.
Does that work? Okay. Good deal. Thanks for coming in. Or who you are.
Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, this was really informative. I
Well-
appreciate the immersion.
I'm so glad you agreed
Well,
to.
it's kind
Willie and I were
of
saying.
is an emergency, but appreciate it.
And Daryl, you're staying overnight for confirmation in the morning? Will be good, because I think our newest
that would be
member,
nice.
none of us have actually met. I think maybe we met him briefly. Bob Ebby is gonna be there.
Yeah, I read about him, yeah.
Yeah, from Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
And I was just looking at the agenda, so the Senate, Nathan's probably shared all this with you, but it meets at 9.
Are you heading?
Well,
Yes.
April 19th.
Do our budget presentation first, right at 9:30, so it'll probably be 20
I was sitting here and got
But
called
you all are
back
the
to the
first one done for
factory.
confirmation, so that's good.
Okay.
As opposed to being buried on the list,
Yeah.
you'll be out by 10:30, I would think.
That's why I called work.
Oh,
Block out the whole day.
I understand.
Well, and
About that.
to tell you,
About that, and then
I should say, the governor's office sometimes wants you to meet with people individually, but. in
I
terms of
need
actual
to, you
hearing,
can go for it. I'm gonna text Randall to tell him
So I
that we
guess
need to.
maybe I should.
Well, I said be there at 8.